Hello, welcome all. Thank you so much for attending our day 2 of the film symposium we've organized, The Golden Age of Cinema in Postwar South Korea. Director Chung of the Korean Cultural Center Los Angeles could not be here today, so I'm going to introduce the program in lieu of him. We're so grateful for KCCLA's generosity in co-sponsoring this event and also being our host for the day. I'm Nahmee Lee. I'm the co-founder of GYOPO, the organization of this symposium. I have to thank our GYOPO volunteers who made this 2-day symposium possible. We're a volunteer-led organization, and everyone's free to reach out to us if you have any interest in working with GYOPO. But I also want to really take a moment to thank Kyung Hyun Kim. Kyung Hyun Kim is also a co-founder of the organization and really was the person who visioned this symposium that we are all enjoying here today. Let's see. We are really, really honored to have the speakers here at the symposium who've flown in from all over the country. And they will be introduced in momentarily, but we just want to take also a moment to just kind of savor this moment where we can all get together and kind of be in a space where we're learning together in a safe and comfortable environment. I will have to thank our sponsors, Susan Beck and Prem Manjuran and Document Coffee. There's coffee and tea and food out there to enjoy during our refreshment break at 2:30. You are not allowed to bring the food and beverages into this space, so please enjoy that stuff out there during our break. And our other co-presenters are the UCLA Korean Studies Department, the Center for the Study of Women, and the Barbara Streisand Center, and Los Angeles County Museum of Art. So I'm going to introduce Nateen now, who can give a few remarks on LACMA's behalf. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming out today. My name is Nateen Du, and I'm the Public Program Specialist at LACMA. I just wanted to say a quick thank you as well to all of our friends and programming partners. I'm also here to remind you that you can reserve some free tickets to LACMA both online and in person by using the very, very secret code of GYOPO. So feel free to do that again, in person or at the box office. In person at the box office or online. I'm also here to share some words from my colleague and exhibition curator, the illustrious, who you may have seen yesterday, Virginia Moon. So she says, when planning the programming for the space between, I felt that Korean films that were just coming out in the 50s and 60s would be helpful to our audience to add an understanding of what Korea was like when many of the artworks in the show were created. For many, the topic of modern art in Korea is an unfamiliar one. And these early films, produced before Photoshop and CGI, give a realistic backdrop of these times. With KCCLA, we had 4 film screenings here in October, and with GYOPO together, we were able to offer this timely and important symposium to delve into deeper issues and themes stemming from the intent and role of these post-war films. Again, have to echo much thanks to Kyung Hyun and for putting together these panels, and yes, and thank you again for joining us.
Thanks all for being here. My name is Kyung Hyun Kim, and I'm the one who conceptualized and co-organized the symposium. We had a wonderful session yesterday at UCLA, and so now we are here for the second and the last session. We are fortunate to, as we enter a realm where we can join our distinguished presenters to rediscover cinematic creations and culture of this complex historical post-war period, including the first fashion designer for films, marginalized women directors, and the questions of language and translation in subtitling. First, I want to thank Yoonju Ellie Lee as working closely with her and GYOPO on this project has been a treasured experience. Second, I will talk about the two images that the brochure designer Edwina Dye, she's here somewhere, brilliantly enlivened with close-ups that illuminate underlying narrative. You guys can come in and sit. It's okay. You can just come in without disturbing me. So the color image that you see, and also in the background you see it completely in contrast. This one is a little bit, well, I guess it's a little bit, yeah. So the, is a representation of Han Young-mo from his early 1956 blockbuster film, Madam Freedom. The resting enlarged, hand-painted face of the patriarch and the continuation of the image on the last page conveyed the broader themes of this melodrama. I've always been fascinated by the hand-painted posters that used to be the way that movies got advertised before photo-based images quickly became dominant. On a related side note, Shin Sang-ok, the other director under our purview, worked in his early days before the Korean War broke out as a painter of posters of commercial cinemas. He had painting background as a high school student in Tokyo. It's believed that this engagement initially got him interested in the film world. This page, center page, central fold-out page, bordered at the top with extreme close-up from Aimless Bullet of two characters locked in a kind of a kiss that had been coined the nicotine kiss, is the romantic retake of a scene from the 1955 Hollywood melodrama Love is a Many Splendid Thing. This racy ignition of both cigarettes and passions achieve a rare alchemy of contemplative distance and up-close and personal intimacy. The director Hyun Kim, also having taught filmmaking, is known as the most intellectual filmmaker of the Korea's golden age. It's interesting to note that Hyun Kim's film played at UCLA in 2000 in the program titled Korean War, The Last 50 Years. He was part of the first major film series devoted to South Korean cinema to travel in the US and Canada that also included Shin Sang-ok and Im Kwon-taek, packaged as three Korean master filmmakers. We have David James here somewhere, who was one of the people who, when he taught at USC, to organize a theater program about Im Kwon-taek. So we're just very blessed. This program also came to UC Irvine in 1998 in their event called Post-Colonial Classics of Korean Cinema. Aimless Bullet was first shown in New York's Museum of Modern Art in 1996 and since has been added to their collection. Many of the speakers here published articles and or books starting in 2005 with the publication of the anthology edited by Kathleen McHugh. Major publications by Shin Sang-ok was published in 2014 by Stephen Chung and in 2015 by Paul Fischer. 2020 saw the book Cold War Cosmopolitanism by Christina Klein, which is also available online, and a new book by Travis Workman is expected this year. Research and interest lives on. I will conclude with this recollection and speculation. Back in April 1960, I was a second grade student out in the streets when I caught a glimpse of the popular protest that ousted corrupt President Syngman Rhee from office in April after he attempted to hold onto power through a rigged election. I was too young to make sense of this historic event called Saigu, the date 419. But I learned later that this outburst of popular sovereignty and the Korean people's collective newfound agency appeared to coincide with the creation of a series of remarkable films that announced the Korean film industry's potential to national and international audiences. I concur that this cinematic renaissance is the golden age that we are considering now. So, the first panel, or the talk that we're giving today, is with the two people who published these books, and there's such amazing books, and I just want to say that Stephen and Paul will be introducing each other, so I'll leave it to you, okay? All right.
Hello everyone, I'm Steve Chung. Since I'll be starting off with by introducing my co-panelists, I thought I would just stay where I am. So it's my privilege and honor to introduce Paul Fischer, who is, as Young-Soo mentioned, the author of a Kim Jong-il production, The Extraordinary True Story of a Kidnapped Filmmaker and Star Actress, which is a terrific book, exhaustively researched, really sort of muckraking kind of research that is then rendered as almost like a true crime kind of idiom, which I found amazingly refreshing after having spent so long in the trenches writing this boring academic book on roughly the same material. Anyway, that book was nominated for a Crime Writers Association award and chosen as one of the best books of 2015 by NPR, Amazon, Kirkus Reviews, and the Library Journal. His most recent book, titled The Man Who Invented Motion Pictures, which I just heard about now from Paul, which also sounds amazingly compelling, and seems poised, I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong, to sort of overturn one of the cherished kind of moments in film historiography. Can I say that?
Yeah, I hope so.
Yes. It was a New York Times editor's choice and selected as one of the newspaper's best true crime works of 2022. His writing on film has appeared in the New York Times, the LA Times, Bright Wall, Dark Room, The Independent, Sci-Fi Wire, and Hidden Campus. And he currently lives not in the UK, as was rendered in the program, but in Edmonton, Alberta. It's my pleasure to introduce Paul Fischer.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephen. That was very kind. I'll introduce Stephen at the end of mine when we switch over. And then let me just set all the buttons and stuff that I'm going to mess up one way or the other. Thank you so much for coming. As you can sort of gather from that introduction, I'm kind of a film guy and a little bit of a generalist. So I thought today I would talk about not just Shin Sang-ok and an overview of his work and kind of where he stood, but I thought I would approach it in sort of a personal way and how I came to be kind of engaged with his work, which is, I think, an unusual way, but maybe more common than it seems. The first Shin films that I ever saw were these, which are a series of films for kids made essentially for the Disney Channel and straight to video called Three Ninjas, which he produced and co-wrote under the name Simon Sheen in the 90s. and which my brothers and I were obsessed with. I had no idea who the people were behind these movies. I had no idea who he was. I was just young, and it had people punching other people and making fart jokes, and I loved it. And in that sense, it was extremely influential. So this was my introduction to one of the great South Korean filmmakers. A few years later, I was reintroduced to him, still not knowing who he was or that he was behind this film. Through this film that my dad, who loved true stories, found one late evening, one Sunday evening, on French television about terrorists blowing up a plane, which I was very young at the time, and it had an extremely grotesque scene of a plane blowing up. It gave me nightmares for years that I still think about every time I board a plane, even though I'm not afraid of flying, but it's still seared into my brain. And so I saw this film, and it was very influential, and I knew nothing about the person who made it. It never crossed my mind that this was the guy who was involved in Three Ninjas, because why would you think it was the same guy? And then several years later, when I was at film school, we had a kind of Wednesday evening tradition that we called Ed Wood Night, where we would watch a terrible film, get high, have a good time, feel bad about ourselves. One of our favorites was Pulgasari, which we all loved Godzilla films. This was one that we could look down on and thought was terrible. It had this vague, scandalous backstory that some abduction victim had made it for Kim Jong-il. And so we had a great time watching it and making fun of it and being very entertained by it. Still made no connection that the guy who made this was the guy who also made the Nightmare Explosion plane movie and the fart joke Karate Kid knockoff. So I kind of come to this in a jokey way, but this was, when I started writing the book, this kind of informed a lot of what I discovered about Shin Sang-ok, which was he was one of those filmmakers throughout his entire career. And all three of these kind of properties, projects, or whatever, are at best the darker days of his career, the not very popular days of his career. He was a filmmaker kind of defined by his flexibility. And that could be in terms of genre, that could be in terms of who he worked with, or which rules he was happy to follow or break, and that was also in terms of all the ecosystems that he moved through. So I was amazed, having been obsessed with this story about the filmmaker who'd been kidnapped in North Korea and made films and so on. I was amazed once I started researching him that not only he was the guy who'd made Pulgasari, and the guy who'd made the plane explosion movie, and the guy who'd produced the Three Ninjas fart joke movies, but he had also been one of the most influential filmmakers in what we know of as the golden age of Korean cinema, as Jung Soon was saying. That he had also been a fox for a long time, and that he was also one half of one of the most glamorous, probably, film relationships in film history that, if you were, like me, a white boy from Europe, you probably should think about as like a Richard Burton, Elizabeth Taylor, Orson Welles, Rita Hayworth, kind of big, larger-than-life filmmaker and his movie star relationship scandal, all of it. And somehow, I had never heard of him. He was also someone who started his career working for himself, and then was flexible enough to work for these guys, and also these guys. So, this is just my little biographical sketch about Shin Sang-ok. If it's too general, and you guys all know this, just boo me. But he was born in 1926 in Chung, studied fine arts in Tokyo, in Japan. And his entry in the industry, as Jung Soon touched on, was through his background as a painter, painting posters, painting backgrounds, eventually working in the production department on Viva Forever, which is considered the first feature made in South Korea after the end of World War II. His first films as director is in 1952 and 1958, The Evil Knight, A Flower in Hell, kind of made his reputation. And then very quickly, he sort of modeled himself on, very consciously as well, on early Hollywood, kind of creative tycoons. Charlie Chaplin comes up a lot. People who made films, who were directors, who were the artistic guiding lights behind the projects, but also thought as producers. And through his company, Shin Film, he made a variety of films that were, these are some of the early ones, that found gigantic success, critical success, popular success, and kind of played out over a variety of genres. And there were times when I was writing the book where I found that people equated the whole industry in the 60s in terms of an infrastructure and ecosystem with this one person, that he was known as one of the leading lights of this age. His career, to me, fascinatingly, going back to this idea of flexibility, versatility, however you want to call it, his career to me was sort of defined by three kind of corners and parameters. One was his relationship with Nahmee, who he married before first putting in a film, but then put in many films. She was more famous than he was before he was famous, more successful. She was the breadwinner, all that kind of stuff. And she was in Flower and Hell, which was the film that brought him to preeminence. She was in later films with him. They started a family together. They were married for over 20 years in a relationship that ended in scandal, as relationships with egotistical men tend to end. And they made a variety of films, which is another kind of defining characteristic of Shin's career from the get-go. He sort of was known to make kind of gritty social realist dramas, melodramas, kind of thought of as for women, the rubber-soled masses who came to the movies, tacky horror films later on, big historical epics. And he kind of had this sense of a filmmaker who, you know, I was talking to Stephen about this, there's this idea, at least for me as a Westerner, when I came to this, there's this idea that the auteur theory was invented by French people in the 60s. And before that, you either had filmmakers who worked for producers or producers who controlled the means of production. And Shin Sang-ok was one of those directors who was a filmmaker, who was creatively driven, made some excellent films, but was also equally notable as a producer concerned with running his company, controlling his means of production, and making popular films, viable films, which became conflated with kind of leading a viable industry. Which touches upon, I found, the third kind of parameter of his career from the start, was that he was a guy who was very comfortable being close with power. Whether it was Park Chung-hee in South Korea in the 60s, that's Shin there, or whether later on it was with this guy. Who eventually, as you know, this is stuff that gets talked about a lot, but in 1978 had people abduct Chae-In-hee first to North Korea, and then Shin Sang-ok, and then put them to work making films for the North Korean regime. Films which were, again, as versatile as the ones he'd made before, whether it's a monster movie, or a martial arts epic, or love stories, or musicals, or fantasies. One of the things that I found extremely interesting about Shin, again, kind of bringing my own experience to him, is that we talk a lot about, there's this idea, at least for me, I went to film school, all this stuff, there's this idea of lauding the filmmaker who will do whatever it takes to make their film. You know, we were told when I was in film school, lie, beg, cheat, steal, these are virtues. Put your film before everything else, these are virtues. And generally speaking, they meant, you know, be Francis Ford Coppola, gamble away your wealth, remortgage your house, or be George Lucas, steal the print from the mean film studio executives. In Shin Sang-ok's case, that might be the only time in film history where that was not hyperbole, because he was someone who took being abducted to a repressive regime, and to all intents and purposes seemed to think, yeah, this is pretty bad, this is horrible, my freedom's limited, I didn't choose this, I'm a captive. But he does give me kind of a lot of money, and he doesn't interfere all that much. Let's see what we can make out of it. And it's worth saying, this is a still from Salt, one of the films Shin and Chae made in North Korea. It's worth noting that she didn't feel that way, not that I can tell. And, you know, I think, again, I was able to meet her, I was not able to meet Shin Sang-ok, we passed by the time I wrote my book. But it was fascinating how Madame Chae was adamant that she would have gone home in the very first second. She could have, and also adamant that he might have made one more film if he could have. And so they stayed in North Korea until 1986, when, in a whole convoluted story involving fake press interviews and being flown out on a plane in hijabs and burqas, they found refuge in America. First under kind of government protection, and then because Shin again, his guiding principle was sort of he wasn't alive if he wasn't making films. He was someone who had taken being in North Korea as my filmmaking license was revoked in South Korea, so if this is the only place I can make films, let me think about it. He eventually made his way to Hollywood to make these films, which were some of the early ones that influenced me and a whole generation of nerdy little kids. And these are fascinating, right? Because again, when I entered kind of my research on these, my take about these was that this is pretty bad. You've had a pretty great career. You're one of the great filmmakers of your nation's industry. You've lived through all this, and now you're making this garbage. But again, to me, sort of exemplified this guy who was a producer as well as a director, whose versatility kind of bordered on stylistic anonymity, and whose primary objective seemed to be to make films. Whatever the cost, whatever the quality, he'd take what he could. And this era of Shin's career, which kind of had the earliest impact on me, he had dream projects. He wanted to make a film about Genghis Khan. He wanted to make a film about his experience in North Korea. But the white people in the offices in Burbank weren't going to make those. But they wanted Karate Kid knockoffs, so he was going to make those instead. And even rip off his own North Korean film. There had been a rip off of a Japanese film. But that's a whole other thing. And so I'm kind of like, this is my personal way into him. And I know I haven't touched on some of the stuff that Stephen's going to touch on, which is going to sound a lot more well-read and knowledgeable than me. But compared to a lot of filmmakers that come up about the golden age of Korean cinema, they have come up this weekend and will come up this weekend, I find Shin extremely compelling because in a way he is not as easy to put in the box as the other ones as an artist because he's sort of easier to put in the box as a producer. But he wore both hats in a way that I don't know that I've come across anybody else doing in any industry, anywhere for so long. And so Stephen's going to touch on that one period, but I always try and keep in mind that Shin was one of those filmmakers who worked over kind of 3 very definite periods. These are just selected films, but in South Korea and North Korea, then I get a bit in South Korea and in America, making completely different films for completely different audiences in 3 completely different cinematic cultures and ecosystems of varying qualities all the way through. And who is defined kind of by a sort of drive, selfish drive, really. There's a saying you'll all be familiar with, I guess, about, I imagine, about people who sleep in the same bed but have different dreams, which was the definition of Shin Sang-ok's career, who could be working in the golden age of South Korean cinema when other people made films for artistic and political reasons and manifestos, and he made them for Shin Film. And he could work in North Korea when he'd been abducted and work within that system to make what served Shin Sang-ok. And he could go back to America and serve up Disney Channel garbage, because that worked for Shin Sang-ok. He could sleep in all these different beds and kind of sustain this focus on his one dream, and who took opportunity maybe better than 99.9% of filmmakers in the world. And who, whatever we think of the quality of his films, and they were up and down all the time, and the films were bad, to me kind of came to define whether he was more of a director or a producer, came to define the idea of someone whose life was committed to creating the work above all. And all of it was influential, whether it was the great successes of the 60s or the surreal attempts at making great films in North Korea, and even influential ones in the 90s, just asking 90s kids about 3 Ninjas and how many times they watched them. So Stephen is going to talk now about kind of Shin's place in the canon of 1960s South Korean cinema, in that golden age period, as we call it. Kind of suitably, Stephen's bio sounds much more impressive than mine. He's associate professor in the East Asian Studies Department at Princeton, where he's also the acting chair of the University Committee for Film Studies. He's the author of Split Screen Korea, Shin Sang-ok and Postwar Cinema, which was published in 2014 and won the Association for Asian Studies Prize for Best Book in Korean Studies that year, which I also read when my book was already at the printers and made me feel very stupid. His other publications include a further reflection on Shin Sang-ok's film A Flower in Hell, which appeared in the University of Michigan Press's Rediscovering Korean Cinema collection in 2019. Thank you very much for taking this little tour.
Great, thanks so much, Paul, for the introduction. I can't overemphasize how much of a pleasure it is to finally meet you and have this conversation. I should say first, thanks to all the organizers, Kyung Min, of course, Nahmee Lee, GYOPO, UCLA, and here at the Korean Cultural Center. I'm sure I'm missing a few, but it's really fun to be back in California, where I spent the first half of my time writing this book. So I am just going to do something a little bit different than what we heard from Paul, because I felt empowered by Paul's expertise in providing that sort of arc of Shin's career to be able to reflect on context a little bit more, particularly the whole question that sort of drove my research was just to try to understand the kind of versatility, opportunism, diversity, energy, and the kind of unique kind of profile that Shin eventually carved out, and to try to make some sense of that in relation to space and time, particularly of post-colonial, post-war Korea. The book that Young-Sun and Paul mentioned was published in 2014. I started it way back in 2005. And since then, there have been substantial developments on Shin and that period of filmmaking. Memoirs by Shin Sang-ok and Chae-eun themselves. Paul's book, a huge number of publications coming out of the Korean Film Archive. Lovers in the Despot, which is an interesting film version of this story. Chae-eun's Passing, the easy accessibility of so many of these films since, we were talking, Scott and I last night, about all of the crazy quasi-legal things that we were doing before 2015, before Korean Film Archive made upwards of 200 films available freely on YouTube, all these bootlegging ventures and that we had to go through. That's changed. More detailed and historically rich studies in the period. Almost all of them, with the exception of Christina Klein's, being published by people who had studied just around the corner from here, UCLA, USC, Irvine, San Diego, and Berkeley. So a lot has happened since I started research on the book and the book came out. So it's kind of fun to be prompted to reflect on what this book might mean in relation to what's happened, but also in connection with what's happening right now with this symposium and the really remarkable exhibition that's going on at LACMA. So that's what I'm going to do. There are three sort of main sort of areas of this reflection. I'm sorry, that sort of reminded me to slow down a little bit. Three areas that I wanted to touch on. The symposium folds these broader studies of post-war Korean filmmaking together with that remarkable retrospective of post-war, not only post-war, sorry, modern Korean art. Second, the symposium, invoking the title Golden Age of Cinema, identifies something remarkable in the period 1954 to 1972, that is, between the end of the Korean War and up to the authoritarian controls over cultural production of the Park Chung-hee Yushin regime. And then third, this conversation that we're having today narrows in on one particular filmmaker, Shin Sang-ok, as a lens through which to apprehend the features of the period. I forgot to do this. Just leave that. a few remarks on these 3 points. Between the art in the space between and the filmmaking of this era, particularly Shin's, the difference, I would argue, in aesthetic possibility, sensibility, and material conditions are really hard to miss. While one of Shin's hallmarks, as Paul was introducing us to, was the huge variety of genres in which he worked, and I have some, these are all completely out of order. Oh, this is actually the wrong set of slides. Okay, that's kind of a disaster. Okay, I'll just improvise, and I feel okay to do so because Paul has sort of already furnished us with a fairly rich visual history of that era. So believe me, Shin works in a huge variety of genres: family melodramas, historical epics, war and Western films, monster pictures, and I think I have it here. Even this 1975 film called I Love Mama, which is a musical, film, roughly similar to maybe Jesus Christ Superstar. So despite that huge variety of genres he hewed closely to what has been variously called the classical Hollywood style, or by others, the institutional mode of representation in film. This was a storytelling language that he was very concerned about mastering, and his films reflect the drive for clarity, exposition, and perhaps most of all, parity with the quality and advancement of Western and especially Hollywood movies. We don't find the sorts of avant-garde experimentation, obfuscation, mixing of materials and medium that we are struck by in the artworks from the same period in Shin's or virtually any other Korean films of the period, with arguably the exception of Kim Gi-young, who we heard about yesterday, and maybe Lee Man-hee, who we'll be hearing about in the afternoon. Indeed, one of the rewards of a massive exhibition like The Space Between is being struck anew by the bold innovations and play of the work from the 1930s or the 1960s, not only of those from whom we expect to work in those idioms like Kim Hyun-gi or Kim Byung-gi, but also works like those by Lee Seung-taek and Lee Yu-tae. I'm sorry, I had slides of their work that I kind of took at the museum yesterday. I find them quite fascinating. We can also identify this gap that I'm kind of exploring between art and, modernist art and filmmaking. We can also identify this gap when we look across global filmmaking in the same period and find, alongside commercial and genre analogs to the sort of films we're talking about in the symposium, a range of experimentations and innovations that nonetheless operate within, or at least in the margins, of commercially viable film, whether that's the bold stylizations of the French New Wave, or the grittier independent films of New Hollywood cinema, or the flourishing avant-garde cinema of Korea's closest neighbor in Japan. Clearly, this has less to do with this has a lot to do with the commercial imperatives and policy regulations around film in this period. In this way, what we can call the constitutive conditions of filmmaking, that is the core notions of what characterizes good film and makes them culturally viable and visible, are nicely highlighted in the broader context of today's events. Two of those conditions, which I reflect on at some length in my book, are worth highlighting here. The first of these is what I've translated as the regional distribution system, which functionally resulted in a reliance of major studios on the tastes of not only, or even primarily, the more urbanized and cosmopolitan Seoul populace, but rather those of the smaller cities and remote regions of the country, South Korea. This is what I call a kind of calculated populism on Shin's part. We can trace a vibrant and sometimes unruly economy of speculation, intervention by opinionated theater owners and investors, and the formation of networks that directly impacted the kind of films that were being made in the period. even or perhaps even especially for the larger studios like Shin Films that strove to maintain their blue chip status in the industry. I wonder if I have any images of it. I do not. I'm sorry, I really should have tested the slides before. But this is, say, one of the watershed moments in this era in which the regional distribution model both influenced the kind of films that Shin was making and handsomely rewarded not only Shin Films but a whole host of other companies at that time. So that was the first thing. The second condition is the comparatively narrow range of aesthetic forms of the period's filmmaking can be understood through reflection on the role of the state, not simply or even most importantly via its import control or censorship mechanisms, but rather in its promotion of an industrial mode of production analogous to the heavier industry sectors of the broader economy and of the aims of international export to foreign film festivals and markets. Shin Films thrived over approximately a 10 or 12 period, producing films that were wildly popular and profitable throughout the peninsula and operating actively across the Asian regional markets. But this also conditioned the careful, market-driven, generically, or maybe even to say formulaically oriented and largely conservative nature of not only Shin's films, but really the vast majority of what we are remembering here in this symposium. Many of our colleagues here, as well as questions posed by the audience members in the symposium, have highlighted a number of surprises about the period's films, about scandalously racy images or particularly compelling insights into the destructive forces of money and debt. Interestingly, these surprises arise almost exclusively on the discursive level, and not, meaning, in terms of the images and the stories and sort of themes that we encounter, and not necessarily at the formal or aesthetic level. The broader context of this symposium with the pieces in the space between help us, I think, to more vividly map Shin's films in what we might, following the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, might see as the field of cultural production. That is, how to see the contemporaneous, modernist, and avant-garde art in relation to the constitution of popular, culturally driven art like the cinema. So the second point that was about modernist art in relation to film, etc. The second point is a little bit more straightforward. This period is indeed a discrete and singular one as far as filmmaking conditions go, and perhaps even style. That is, just to remind you, 1954 to 1972. It's characterized on the one hand by how prolific the industry was, highlighted in the late 1960s by upwards of 160 or 170 films being produced every year, and perhaps the creation of some really remarkable films, many of which are being discussed throughout the symposium, including Kim Kyung's The Housemaid and Yoo Hyun-mok's The Stray Bullet, which Young-soon mentioned. Just as a side note, I was reflecting that the only copy that we have of some reels of Obartan or Stray Bullet were the ones that were salvaged from the 1960s screening, not in LA, but in San Francisco, at one of the early iterations of the Asian Film Festival there. Yes, all that prolific production on the one hand, and on the other, by the close implication of the state in the film industry, not only the laws reflecting what kind of images could be shown, but also by the productive mechanisms that mandated to the letter the size and practices of studios, import-export quotas, etc. With a career that began right around 1954 and closed its first chapter towards the mid-1970s, as we heard from Paul, Shin Sang-ok indeed might be synonymous with this golden age. And indeed, with the various iterations of his film studios, Shin Films, and what you see here on your right is the Anyang Film Studio, this massive really just unwieldy complex that he took over in the late 1960s. And as well as the adventures exporting and even producing films abroad, most notably in Hong Kong. And the collapse of the commercial and aesthetic success of his career, Shin certainly does embody the period. One can perhaps go so far as to say that he helped create that period. But it's worth underscoring here the kind of heterogeneity and even conflict that's minimized or lost altogether by the designation of an age, whether it's a golden age or a dark age. We make these periodizations in the attempt to capture a broader essence, a sensibility, or even the continuities that belie the easy periodizations of decades, or political regimes, or technological networks. But in Korea, it's those divisions, particularly decade divisions, that are indeed powerful and to a great extent illuminating markers. The more frenetic and outward-looking era of the Lee Sung-man 1950s, for instance, the quickly regimented but largely enterprising and arguably hopeful early years of the Park Chung-hee regime, and that in contrast with the more qualitatively repressive and instrumentalized Yushin years in the late 1960s and early 1970s. All of these witnessed the marked differences in the kinds of films that could be produced. Interestingly, perhaps not surprisingly, we find this differences reflected in Shin Sang-ok's films. I know I keep complaining about my error in preparation, but luckily I do have some images salvaged from this primitive version of my slides. So we saw some of these images yesterday. Virginia and Christina, I think, had shown some of these. So this is from Shin Sang-ok's 1959 film, A Sister's Garden. These lush, urban, family-centered, meticulously constructed, very sort of unabashedly sort of Europhilic, Americaphilic kind of films. In contrast to, say, just a few years later with the advent of the Park Chung-hee regime, films like Rice or Evergreen, which I call Enlightenment films in the 1960s. And then this will stand in for a kind of symbol of that period, 1970s, kind of genre messes, experimentations, much reduced budgets, etc. So anyway, the point is that even within the larger contours, which I find very compelling, of this designator, the golden age of post-war Korean cinema, we can find these very important differences in the style of not only Shin's, but many of the films of that period. So that was point 3. I need to rush and try to finish up point 3. I'm just trying to figure out how I'm going to do this without the images that I prepared. I'll try to be as descriptive as possible. So this is all then closely related to the third point, which concerns the question of authorship and the identification of Shin as an icon of this period. There has, of course, been a whole variety of approaches to the problem of individual authorship in film, from the valorization of a kind of global pantheon of unique visions that constitute world cinema, to the identification of traces or signatures of authorship within the mechanisms of industrial filmmaking, to the outright critical dismissal of individual artistry within the face of sort of new film critical reading practices. So, to what extent can we productively think of Shin as a film author? Is there a consistency to his body of work to which we can ascribe some identifiable style or set of thematic concerns? I should say immediately that I'm actually much more sympathetic to Paul's idea that his very signature is versatility and flexibility. So Shin is popularly known for his drive to build a studio, to produce high-level, technically polished films for the most part, and his collaboration with the state. But stating the case a little strongly in hindsight after having written the book, the whole reason I think I was attracted to Shin as a means of thinking about post-war Korea and for reflecting on the cultural and political place of cinema is really the heterogeneity and unevenness across the body of work that spans such a tumultuous time in modern Korean history. So I won't detail this, I sort of go back over ground about the diversity of his career. So I just want to finish up by sort of meditating on two different films. The first is, I think we saw an image of it, this one, Chung Hyun, which has been made into films in South Korea at least a dozen times. It's a folk tale. And interestingly, he goes, Shin Sang-ok makes this particular film twice. The second version being up in North Korea under the title Oh My Love. A few more, I don't have time to provide details of that, maybe we can chat about it in the second half. What's notable about Song Chun-hyang, the 1961 South Korean version, is that essentially it was kind of like synonymous with the kinds of production practices and aesthetic vision that really launched the heyday of Shin's career. Color cinemascope, star power, meticulous historical detail, really patient, sort of long shots and long takes, and all of that. This is what I call in the book a kind of earnest primitivism that really sort of seemed to resonate as much with urban audiences in Korea as it did with rural audiences. So that's one, real watershed in Shin's career. Let me see if I can get through this argument quickly enough. There have been rich suggestions throughout the symposium, and certainly in the broader scholarship around post-war film, that the best films of the era articulate a kind of critique of patriarchal norms. These qualities certainly can be found in Shin Sang-ok's films, but in my view, Song Chun-hyang and the vast majority of Shin's films from the period are, and I'm going to just use this kind of as a sledgehammer a little bit here, conservative films, despite the way that they expose the injustices and violence embedded in misogynistic ideals. My argument in the book is that these expositions of misogyny are embedded in a reserved and careful depiction of both pre-modern and modern patriarchal structures that by and large celebrate patience and perseverance and suffering on the part of women as the only possible and perhaps even virtuous disposition to patriarchal norms. In short, the suffering of women is rendered inevitable and even beautiful in his films. But I want to contrast what we see in Song Chun-hyang with something a little bit late that comes up a little bit later. This film, 1969 film called Cruel Tales of the Yi Dynasty Women. The film is characterized, it's a very minor film. I don't know how many people have written on it since my book came out, but I don't remember coming across any writing on it when I was deep in the archives. The film is characterized by a number of formal experiments. A 4-part omnibus structure is the most notable of these, although unfortunately one of the 4 reels or sections, 2 of the reels I think were lost and not never digitized. But so too was the film's somewhat awkward mixing of melodrama, period piece, and horror film codes. So this is very unusual in Shin's work, as well as the overall grittiness. There's a kind of gritty rawness to this film that I found quite striking. This departure from the customary idiom was substantially conditioned by the novel constraints that Shin began to face by the 1960s. The move of production to those sprawling Anyang studios that I give you an image of, and the splitting of the studio into a number of smaller units meant that budgets for individual films were much smaller than those that were applied to films like the 1961 Song Chun-young. The late 1960s also witnessed the hardening of the Park Chung-hee regime's developmentalist program into a more narrowly repressive routine that lacked the optimism of the first half of the decade. The result is that Cruel Stories takes on the feel of a B movie or even a pink movie, raw and luridly sensationalist. Qualities that I want to stress were almost entirely absent in Shin's earlier films. And I want to suggest, with this formal aesthetic novelty, a burgeoning critical spirit arose. Right? And I don't want to detail this at length, but I just wanted to flag how we see a kind of fly-by-night, mercenary, low-budget experimentation in this film at the same time as we have, I would say, for the first time in Shin's career, the concrete, explicit identification of the perpetrators of Neo-Confucian and even modern forms of patriarchal violence, which is this maybe epitomized in this tableau. Do I have time for this? Just a quick summary. The main character of this film, played by Cheon-hee, not surprisingly, is castigated by her in-laws for her seeming inability to have children. It turns out that it was in fact her husband who's sterile. In the course of this segment of the film, she seduces the character on the left there, and becomes pregnant and has this child. It's later discovered, this is kind of sounds convoluted, but that her husband is sterile, and that she conceived the child with this servant, and then kills herself to protect the honor of the family. And this is the last image we have in this segment of this awful tableau of a patriarchal grandfather, an ambivalent husband, and then the true father of this scion of the family who must hide the fact that he is the father of this child. So it's this very interesting moment in an otherwise crude and experimental film that I think encourages us to think about the kinds of economic, social and cultural context for what we have identified as authorship in Shin Sang-ok and other filmmakers of the period. I feel like I've kind of gone over time, but that's it for now. We'll now begin, I think, a conversation. So we actually haven't talked about how we're going to do this.
No. But, okay, I'll start. So I'm fascinated by, how to phrase this? I'm fascinated by this idea that you touched on there with that second film. That, I guess when I came to the book, you have this idea generally that he made these great big prestigious films, and in like all careers, maybe he loses his touch and he makes kind of more desperate films. So I'm fascinated by whether it's the studio or the changing conditions, or what happened later in North Korea. As you touched upon, we can kind of chart his films, not through like necessarily a creative impetus, like I want to make an omnibus now about this stuff, but by what are the conditions I got to work under, and that kind of defines the films more than, I'm Shin Sang-ok, I want to make this film, that's my passion. Which is interesting, because it makes sense of that decade, I guess better than I had a conception of, and I wonder if you can talk about that a bit more, especially the later years. There's kind of a gap for me in the 70s, where you get these films, they really are like B movies, they really are like garish and tacky, and in the sense that he's kind of pushing the boundaries of what's acceptable in the garish and tacky until it bites him. if that makes sense.
With the censorship.
With the censorship and kind of, you know, having his license revoked eventually.
Yeah, I mean, I think I gloss over the 70s as much as you did in your mind. Because I think I was a little bit more committed to like rich, you know, well-conceived, well-executed films as being the like core condition for writing about films, right? Because I don't think, I mean, Scott was saying that he teaches a class on bad films. I didn't sort of get that idiom of writing or sort of reflecting back then, and so yes, the entire period from roughly 1969 to when he starts making films in North Korea, with the exception of referring to some of those kind of, you know, scenes and images in the mid-70s films that got him into legal trouble, I completely ignored, but which I find kind of fascinating now. I mean, the kind of story of decline, I think, is equally as interesting as the story of a kind of flourishing. But just to more directly answer at least part of your question, I think, yeah, it was like the kind of machinery of, like this monstrous machinery of the studio that he really wanted and actually built, like, you know, faster probably than he could have expected in 1960. He's a part of, like, you know, these governing bodies that sort of create the laws that conveniently make his studio one of only a handful of film studios that could actually qualify as a film studio. And then it's just swimming in cash from like for a couple of years after that. Right? And like the momentum of that studio meant that he's got like, you know, half dozen, if not more, directors under his employ. He's got like this army of staff, projects flowing in, writers creating scripts, and I think what he would do was to like take the more prestige projects that were being developed for himself and then farm out the kind of less high budget, you know, less involved productions for some of the assistant directors and other directors in his company. And when it came time, in the slow decline of his studio in the late 60s, I think that he was, not sort of foregrounding and sort of hatching, sort of visions about the kinds of films that he wanted to associate with his kind of signature. Although, I think as you were suggesting towards the end of your talk, the one project that he really kind of babied but never executed throughout his life, right, was the Genghis Khan one, right? Yeah. And in fact, Young-sun was telling me that she had a family friend who, in LA, who she was collaborating fairly closely with to try to get funding and stuff. So that was like the one project, or did you know about that? Or?
No, yeah, that was the one which I was always fascinated. This is an aside about that one, but there was kind of a sense of the pitch that, there have been Genghis Khan movies, but it's John Wayne playing Genghis Khan. It's ridiculous. But then you'll read about stuff, I think there's an article, a memoir about someone who helped him with the project, where he's, and I might be approximating the name or something, but where he's going, we'll get Sophia Loren to be Genghis Khan's mom. And you go, wait, that's the thing you're not meant to do. That's an interesting, but I wanted to touch also upon when you were speaking there, how influential was he, both as a successful filmmaker, were there people in that ecosystem or a movement of people who wanted to make films like his, whatever that means, and how influential was he in giving other filmmakers their starts, I suppose, if he had such a big machine producing smaller pictures as well?
Yeah. I mean, like everything to do with Shin Sang-ok in this period, I can't really sort of speak like with definitive closure on that, but the Korean Film Archive has really just been like an amazing resource for research in this period, and part of what they did was to do hundreds, if not thousands of hours of oral histories with filmmakers, actors, screenwriters, directors from this period. And so I tried to go through as many of the interviews that touched on Shin Sang-ok as possible. And I don't remember like robust mention of like a feeling of indebtedness to like his style, right? Or his thematic concerns. I mean, certainly there was like a mix of like admiration, maybe even resentment over like his outsized place in the industry, and also like, a lot of young filmmakers modeling like his obsession with like technical competence, right? I mean, it's hard to overemphasize like how difficult it must have been to make films in the 1950s, scrounging around for film prints and working with like secondhand cameras and all that sort of thing. And Shin Sang-ok was obsessed with making like competent, like continuity and that sort of thing. So I think there's a lot of mention of how Shin could serve as a kind of template for making like really competent films, but in terms of style,
There is a very quick growth. I didn't touch on this enough, but there is that thing that A Flower in Hell in 1958 almost feels like guerrilla filmmaking in the way that we may think about it now. And then 3 years later, they're CinemaScope pictures, and they're massive and in color. And I can't think really of many filmmakers who in 3 years, under those conditions, made the jump from sort of there to there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, how do you account for that?
I don't know. The sense I get is that he was a very driven person and a very, very good producer, I suppose, as much as a director, in all the ways that we think of producers as, they'll make stuff happen, they'll find their way to the influential people, they'll get stuff that works. And I think, obviously, my leading lady and my wife is gigantically popular, obviously helps. But you get the sense that he kind of set his eye on, as oversimplified in pop psychology it is, kind of set his eye on, I'm going to be the biggest deal here, and then sort of manifested it almost. And that idea that aesthetically he was increasingly flexible, or that's really interesting to me, that the films themselves, excuse me, are on a par, if not secondary, with the act of making the films, if that makes sense. That a film in itself, there's a way for me that his body of work makes more sense than each individual choice of making each film, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I said if that makes sense 9 times in 2 sentences, so it probably didn't.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. I mean, yeah, there are some gems in there, like How Flower and others that I think bear like close scrutiny and celebration and all that. Right? But for me, I mean, Kyung Hyun yesterday talked about Kim Gi-young. I mean, Kim Gi-young is a completely different kind of filmmaker. Right? He essentially made the same film over and over throughout his entire career. Right? Shin Sang-ok is defined by the breadth and what he's able to do. I was actually just sort of realizing that there might be an interesting way to think about that compressed development of because one thing that neither of us mentioned today, but I think both of us talk about in our respective books, is that Shin Sang-ok was kind of like the first to adopt a lot of these early film technological innovations like the CinemaScope, the zoom, and others. And like a part of it, kind of going along with the theme of what I was talking about, is like the economic place of Korea at this point, where in so many ways Koreans were reading about and watching films made in a slightly more advanced technological idiom without having the means to appropriate them in the native industry. And so when they actually were importable, it was almost like this kind of fantasy about like what could be done with that technology became like easily adaptable in a sense, right? So, you know, although I think, you know, reading some of those oral histories that I mentioned, you do, you know, come across people who needed to be kind of like to jerry-rig like technologies like for existing kind of infrastructures. And, you know. Can I ask you? I've been like really eager to ask you this. So I was super fascinated by like the story that you told about your kind of encounters with Shin Sang-ho. But can you say something about like the moments when like you realized that yes, like you wanted to dedicate like years to like researching and writing about this project? Like what was the trigger there?
Ironically, it was not being able to make movies. Because I went to film school, I wanted to be a screenwriter, I wanted to be a filmmaker. And I'd made a few short films and got some money, but I was in this period where I had feature stuff that wasn't happening, and it wasn't so much that I couldn't pay the bills, because I worked on film sets and did all that. But you'd write these screenplays and then have months where you're just waiting, and nothing was happening, and I needed something to be sort of stimulating. And in my mind, I'd read, so this is 2010, 2011, I'd read this sort of little snippets you'd get in The Guardian or something about the oversimplification will always be Kim Jong-il, he's so crazy, holes in one, invented a burger, kidnapped his favorite filmmaker. And I'd be like, that last bit's weird and interesting. I don't care about the golf or the burger or the whatever, but the idea, and I assumed, okay, well I guess if he did kidnap his favorite filmmaker, A, who's your favorite filmmaker? And B, since it's always mentioned in passing, you must have had this guy for like a weekend, and then let him go. And maybe that's an interesting like short film or a little play, and I've always been fascinated by this idea, which again is quite Western, but this weird twisted concept of male genius and the film director is kind of the god of his own little world. And so I figured, okay, that's an interesting kind of play, this idea of this young guy who wants to be literally the god of his world, and he's kidnapping this older guy who's been the god of his own little fictional world. Maybe that's a little short film or something. And then I remember being in the pub, which is where all good things in Britain happen, talking to someone about it, and they went for the first time, okay, so he kidnapped him, and then what? And I realized I'd never thought about that. So we Googled it, and I realized, okay, he kept him for 8 years. Okay, he's not actually his favorite filmmaker. Okay, some people think he wasn't actually kidnapped. Okay, there's this amazing relationship with this actor and filmmaker in her own right. He made 3 Ninjas? And I kind of went from there to there, and then found the Miyumi thing, and I went, oh yeah, Pulgasar, I remember that, that's him. And I think for me, the way to get into it was, I'm fascinated by filmmakers and the experience of making film, and I think maybe, and I wasn't as aware of this as I am now, having written a couple books. I think it's because it's the one of those creative mediums that isn't a person in their room by themselves, that you are constrained by money, collaborators, circumstance, and that you can't really define what the talent is. There's a great Mike Nichols quote about filmmaking is kind of like sex. Everybody does it, but you don't get to see how anybody else does it, so you don't know what's good. And that's kind of the thing about filmmaking. Okay, what's it like to make these films? Because no one knows what makes you good, really. What is it? You know, you go to film school going, Steven Spielberg, how does he make, and he just goes, I make good choices, I guess. And I found Shin fascinating for that because, okay, you make great films and then terrible films, and then they're all over the place, and you worked in all these different circumstances, and I think really early I came to this idea of, you know, having read the memoir, and I was in a weird situation when I wrote up a proposal for the book, because again I had nothing to do, no one was buying my films, sent it out, within a few days I had agent meetings. And there was one agent called Patrick Walsh in London who had tried to sell the translation rights of their memoir years and years before, the kind of possibly maybe CIA Ghost Written one. And his experience was no one wanted to read, and no one in the English language wanted to read that version of their story. But he felt like, and the way stuff happens, they'll read the white boys version of the story. And so he had an interesting insight into it, which was he was able to get me a copy of the memoir, and you were able to get a sense of that kind of core idea of like, oh yeah, this guy really just would have done anything to make a movie. It sort of didn't feel like he was alive or was worth living unless he was making movies, to the point where by the very end he's making whatever can come his way, which I found really compelling. And then I found as an outsider that this was an interesting way for me to learn stuff about South Korea and North Korea and the history and the film culture that I would be able to express to people like me who didn't have an into it, who didn't have an experience to it. And then that would sort of be, the ear of that story would be film dorks like me who hadn't gone to that bit of the film world but would love it. And that he and Shane were kind of the larger-than-life main characters that could take you there.
We're supposed to move it to the audience Q&A, but just I'm dying to ask this last question, which is, so as moving from filmmaking to conceiving the book, you never thought early on, oh, this should be a film?
No, I didn't, and people said you should make a documentary, and I've made documentaries, and I hate making documentaries. And my first thought was, I don't have footage, he's dead, don't think I'm getting Kim Jong-il to sit down with me. So I don't have all the raw materials to make a documentary interesting. Which was, interestingly, eventually, when I think I'd finished writing the book, and the people making The Lovers in the Despot sent me an email, and I did a little interview that they cut out eventually, but part of the reason I did it was they had the sense of, we have this bit in the story where we don't have the material, and we didn't want to have talking heads, but we might need talking heads to explain it. And so they tried it, and that didn't work, and then there's the reconstructions, but I just thought, I don't have the materials to make the documentary there would be good. And then, in terms of a fiction film, I think there were issues of scale and feasibility, and like, I think this can't be emphasized enough, but in like mainstreamish popular Western film, there's kind of like a pre-Crazy Rich Asians and a post-Crazy Rich Asians. I know that sounds really stupid, but like, when people were optioning the rights to the book, for instance, once the book was written, every meeting had a, can we have a CIA guy save them? So they could have a white guy in there kind of thing, so you can go, Benedict Cumberbatch might do this. And I was kind of aware at the time that like, I'm nobody, I don't have the clout to do this. And then I think the second part of that was, rightly or wrongly, in book form, it felt like I could honor the idea that I'm an outsider speaking to a certain audience, but in fictionalized movie form, for some reason, there was more of a sense that I'm not the right person to kind of fictionalize this, if that makes sense. And then on top of that, I was just like, this is going to be a massive book with so much information that I do not have the skills to put in 90 minutes. Which is how it ended up turning out. It was useful to have 100 pages pre-kidnapping, for instance.
Great. Thanks so much. Yes, so we're now to transition to a conversation more with everybody here. I don't know, I guess, I'm pretty good at moderating, in fact. So I'll just field questions. Yes, we see one there.
Hi, I have two questions. I have two questions. Hi, I have two questions. It's not on.
Maybe we can try this. This one's working for sure.
Thank you very much for the program. It's been quite enlightening. I have two questions. One, when you spoke about his later film and that obscure film and the father was sterile, how did they know he was sterile back in those days without all the medical knowledge that we have today? That's the first question. The second question is how I find it almost identical with all the film compared to all the Korean dramas that are being made for TV today. One, the frantic amount of drama, which is what he did. Two, the misogyny, the patriarchal society, the cultural norms, and they're almost identical. So in terms of the film and then moving into the present with the Korean dramas and their popularity, it seems to be the same type of work being done and the same themes and the same culture.
Is this on? No, it is. I can only address unexpectedly the first question, which is that yes, the father is not a father. I mean, the husband has a consultation with a Hanisa. I don't know how to translate, a traditional medicine practitioner who somehow through pulse measurements or something determines that yes, he's sterile. He's sterile. The twist is that in fact the husband's father, the real patriarch of the family, knew all along that his son was sterile and was kind of performatively casting doubt and blame on the daughter-in-law. So it's like this empty violence, this totally hypocritical violence, which becomes even more scandalous part of the film's narrative. I guess I would say that there's no lack of scandalous codes in contemporary Korean dramas. I mean, it seems like there's a tremendous heterogeneity of them now, where there are sophisticated kind of reconfigurations of old conflicts between mother-in-laws and daughter, whatever it is. But sometimes they just kind of revert to the switched at birth, coma, kind of, whatever narrative. So yes, I want to immediately to say, no, the narratives are different. The treatment of these family, conflicts is profoundly different, 2022 versus 1960. But in fact, yes, we have to admit that there are some continuities there. But yes, thank you.
Sorry, it's not.
Yes, I just had a question. I noticed with the film, at the beginning it seems that the director tried to embrace the Korean identity, and then later during the decades, that, as you explained, the decline, I guess, of his passion making different films, and certain laws that prevented possibly his passions, and then the government also oversight or control of his ability to make certain films. Then he diverted or made a switch, do you think, to making those other films later in his career. Do you think that government influence affected him so much, as you mentioned his passion being a director and producer? Then when he was kidnapped to North Korea, I was just thinking of the timeline of all these occurrences, and maybe how in North Korea, obviously the regime was much more strict or restrictive, and you think that maybe he had some political influences in his movie making?
I feel like I can mostly speak to the North Korean part of it, which oddly Shin's films during that period, he had more leeway to make different things than one might expect. There are martial arts films and musicals and love stories. I get the sense, you can speak to this better than me probably, I get the sense that from the very start, as you said, aesthetically and in how you would build your kind of control of your means of production, he had an eye to Hollywood from the get-go. And then I don't know how you feel if that gets lost along the way, or if it's just a question of scale, and then where do you go from there? But it might have always been from the start adapting a pre-existing model to those circumstances.
I mean, like everything else, I think, yeah, there's just so much transformation and improvisation, over these 20 years. Hollywood, for sure, was like the kind of, shining ideal. But I think, as many researchers have shown, that it's like first the Japanese and then the kind of European, kind of modernist experimentations and technical polish, which are, like, especially in the Japanese case, like the shadow models for a lot of what's happening in this period. And some friends of mine have done kind of informal and formal research, sort of tracing, which films are like rip-offs, like these kind of like shadow rip-offs of like Japanese films, which, as many of you know, were banned in Korea up until the late 1990s. But just super quick to answer part of that question, I don't think that, as a result of these transformations, that Shin somehow walked away from like Koreanness or the depiction of Korean culture or Korean history. In fact, even something like Three Ninjas, he himself talked about like wanting to make a Koreanized Home Alone, right? Which was that kind of vague model for that film. So I think he was like really, unevenly, but still committed to sort of a kind of cultural promotion and the idiom of Koreanness, however, inaccurate or whatever that was.
Yeah, that feels right.
Okay.
Oh, I think if I could go next. My question was more about the studio systems. You talked about a little bit how Shin finagled his way into becoming one of the ones to have greater means of production, control over his means of production. How did that happen? I'm curious. And then also a broader question about when did a sort of independent filmmaking in Korea start to emerge? Was that after this quote-unquote golden age, when the regime started? Do we have accounts of independent filmmaking during this studio-controlled time? And yeah, I'll stop there.
Actually, I was hoping that Paul would take that first question on because I don't know the nitty-gritty of how Shin was somehow became part of those conversations around like motion picture laws. A lot of that story like exists like in innuendo as far as I can tell, like in interviews. Like there's a lot of disaffected former Shin films where people who are burned by him or whatever who say that like he was always going in and out of the Blue House, and like Chaney was somehow like rumored to be some connection with Blue House people, but I don't know the specific mechanisms around like how Shin was able to get himself integrated there.
I don't either. There is that euphemistic kind of palace intrigue. They were sort of favored. I guess combined with just that really simple thing of if you make a bunch of films that make a bunch of money, you have more money to make bigger films that make more money. And if you manage that right, then you end up with a gigantic studio you can't pay for. And that's kind of like a boulder around your neck. But I think it was a combination of those two things of there's talk even eventually, and I kind of touch upon it on the book, and it's the same innuendo-wise, that when Shin's filmmaking license was eventually revoked, that it may have been as much about the breach of censorship within the films as offending Park Chung-hee's personal sensibilities by humiliating Chaney the way he did. So there's all this kind of mix of palace intrigue and charisma and exploitation and opportunity with, if you make these huge films, then you've got a cash flow. And I guess the best we can say is that he was very good at least for a while, manipulating those two things. I think we have time for one more, from what I can tell from the panicked messages on the prompter.
Actually,
no more questions. Sorry. They're playing us off with the music.
Great. Thank you very much.
Great. So for this part of our symposium, we have Laura Ha Reizman acting as moderator. Laura is a postdoctoral fellow in the Korean Humanities at Johns Hopkins University. Her research explores the politics of representation for mixed-race Koreans of the Cold War era. As an interdisciplinary scholar, her research and teaching encompasses modern Korean literature and film, with a particular passion for post-war Korean cinema. So she is going to moderate this portion. And I just want to also say that Laura is a GYOPO program committee volunteer, and we're really lucky to have her on our committee. And she has been co-leading a program that's coming up later on this February 23rd. We have a program on mixed race Korean identity. And so check the GYOPO website and put that on your calendar. Laura will be back in LA for that. So Laura.
Thanks, Ellie. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, I just wanted to thank Young-Soon Min for inviting me to moderate, and I'm very privileged to be here. I'm very excited. And so this panel is, overall, we're talking about regarding this golden period and broader cinematic historical context. And the first person who's going to be speaking is going to be David Scott Diffrient, and he is professor of film and media studies in the Department of Communication Studies at Colorado State University. His articles have been published in several journals and edited collections about film and television topics. He's the author of numerous books, actually, but I'm going to only highlight a couple. And that is Comic Drunks, Crazy Cults, and Lovable Monsters, Bad Behavior on American Television, as well as Body Genre, Anatomy of the Horror Film, that's coming out now. This year, great. And with co-author Hae-Sung Chung, Movie Migrations, Transnational Genre Flows, and South Korean Cinema, and Movie Minorities, Transnational Rights Advocacy, and South Korean Cinema. So Professor Diffrient is going to be talking about, the title of his talk is Auteur Lee Man-hee, Genre and Cultural Intermixing in South Korea's Golden Age, War Films. So after, he will talk about Lee Man-hee's two films. One is The Men of YMS 504, as well as The Marines Who Never Returned. I'm going to just stop there. Yeah.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to this talk. I'm going to add my voice to the chorus of appreciations for GYOPO and the Korean Cultural Center. I'm very honored to be part of this symposium, to have been invited. It's already been a really fascinating series of presentations, which began yesterday at UCLA. I'm not sure how many of you attended that series of talks. UCLA is my alma mater, and it's where I received my doctorate degree in film studies. I was very fortunate to be taking courses on East Asian film, Korean cinema under people like David James, who was teaching at both USC and UCLA. But more importantly to today's talk, UCLA was the place where I first encountered many of the Korean films that I'll be referencing today. When I was pursuing my PhD at UCLA nearly 25 years ago, South Korean cinema was just beginning to break into international markets. Thanks to such Hollywood-style blockbusters as Shiri, this is writer-director Kang Jae-gyu's Samsung-backed motion picture about secret intelligence agents in the South who attempt to foil a terrorist attack from the North. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this film, which, despite its emphasis on bombastic spectacle and dazzling visual effects, is rooted in what some would say are distinctly Korean sentiments around national division and the endlessly deferred prospect of reunification. So while many of my graduate cohort at UCLA were lapping up Shiri and another action-filled blockbuster, the mystery thriller JSA, Joint Security Area, directed by Park Chan-wook, I was busy attending several of the special film programs that were being hosted by the university and other venues around the city, including those that celebrated the work of an earlier generation of Korean filmmakers and brought to light heretofore undiscovered classics from the nation's cinematic golden age of the 1950s and 60s. And so for me, the greatest discovery from that formative period of my film education were the motion pictures directed by Nahmee Lee. He is a man whose name is now spoken in the same breath as those of Shin Sang-ok, Yoo Hyung-mok, Kim Ki-young, and Kim Soo-young, but who 20 or 25 years ago was something of a shadowy figure, at least to neophytes such as myself, who wanted to learn more about some of the lesser-known South Korean films produced during the 1960s. And so it was great interest that I viewed his 1963 war film, The Marines Who Never Returned, which, as a commercially successful film that attracted a domestic audience of 230,000 people and snagged Nahmee Lee his first Best Director honor at the newly launched Grand Bell Awards, also known as the Daejeon Film Awards, as well as the Blue Dragon Awards. It's certainly not an obscure title. I imagine there are some people here today who have seen the film or at least heard of it. But I felt then, when I first watched The Marines Who Never Returned at UCLA's James Bridges Theater, that it was as deserving of scholarly attention as Yoo Hyung-mok's Obatan, or Stray Bullet, and we heard about Kim Sanyo or The Housemaid. Those are two classics from the period that were already generating lots and lots of critical commentary, scholarly commentary. I thought that this was a film that was equally deserving, and so too was the filmmaker, Nahmee Lee. Thankfully, I was, and I still am, married to a Korean person whose father started recording all the older films. Stephen Chung mentioned this in his talk, that several years ago, EBS would have weekly broadcasts around 7 or 8 o'clock, classic Korean films. They would broadcast weekly on EBS, and every couple of months, my father-in-law would mail us these lovingly packaged boxes of VHS tapes with those off-air recordings. And that's really how I managed to watch dozens and dozens and dozens of motion pictures directed by people like Nahmee Lee, including the period social drama A Watermill, which was only partially intact when it aired. I remember when it was aired, and of course I got the VHS tape, it didn't have all the sound elements intact, so I was only seeing a partial version of A Watermill from 1966, also the contemporary crime drama / romantic drama, The Starting Point from 1967, the Manchurian Western, Break Up the Chain from 1971, and other war films such as A Hero Without a Serial Number from 1966, and The Men of YMS 504, which was produced and released the same year that he made Marines, 1963. In fact, I had the privilege of watching several Korean war films, including those directed by other filmmakers, like Kim Ki-duk, not that Kim Ki-duk, but a different Kim Ki-duk, Kim Ki-duk's Five Marines, and Shin Sang-ok's Red Muffler, Pagon Mahora, that had been supported by President Park Chung-hee's anti-communist regime at the time of their production in the early to mid-1960s. And I'm going to be coming back to the material and militaristic support that the Park regime provided to filmmakers at that time, because that is a very important facet of their production, without which, of course, they wouldn't have been made. All of that inspired me. So all of that, I was certainly thrust into classic golden age Korean cinema, and I was just consuming as much as I could, and all of that inspired me to write an essay, Military Enlightenment for the Masses, Genre and Cultural Intermixing in South Korea's Golden Age War Films, which was published in Cinema Journal and which forms the basis or the core of my talk today. My article, by the way, came out in 2005, and that's the same year that the Busan International Film Festival held a retrospective screening of A Day Off, a modernist triumph from 1968 that had been originally banned from public viewings by the censors, but was finally seeing the light of day thanks to the ongoing efforts of the Korean Film Archive. And I cannot overstate how important the Korean Film Archive has been, especially in rescuing the work and burnishing the reputation of Nahmee Lee some 30 years after his premature death at the age of 44. So before getting to the meat of my presentation, I just want to briefly sketch in some biographical details of Nahmee Lee's life leading up to his passing in 1975. He passed away from cirrhosis of the liver, and there were a lot of other factors that played a part in his early demise, but that was in 1975, and I wanted to do that so that you have a better sense of what distinguishes him from his contemporaries, and why the themes of this film, The Marines Who Never Returned, might have resonated with him personally. So, as the youngest of 8 siblings, born to a fairly well-off family on the outskirts of Seoul in October of 1931, Imani nurtured an early love of cinema and spent much of his adolescent years attending screenings of European and American films at Gwangmu Theater, Donghua Theater, and other non-academic settings, in lieu of soaking up more traditional forms of education in school classrooms. He was not known to be a very good student, but he spent a lot of time, probably an unhealthy amount of time, in movie theaters. By his own admission, he was not a good student, but he developed a preternaturally strong grasp of the cinematic medium through habitual exposure to movies throughout the colonial era, including propagandistic yet aesthetically sophisticated works by Kyung who is one of the stalwarts of the industry, the nascent industry under Japanese rule. After Korea regained its independence in August of 1945, this is right around the time that Che was making his greatest film, Chayumanse, or Hooray for Freedom, released the following year. Imani, who was that time obviously a teenager, he was nearing graduation, he seriously began to consider the viability of pursuing a career in filmmaking, but had to postpone that dream with the outbreak of the Korean War. Of course, beginning in 1950, he served as a signalman in the military. He attained the rank of sergeant by the end of the war. And as you might imagine, there weren't that many opportunities to make dramatic features during that 3-year period. Although a few documentaries about trainees and soldiers were released in the months leading up to the 1953 ceasefire, including 3 works by an early master of the war film genre that I would be remiss if I did not mention, Yoon Bong-joon. So he made films like The West Front from 1951, Footprints of the Barbarian from 1951, and The Road of Glory from 1951. And again, those are documentary films. And as I note in my article, Yoon had been a founding member of the Korean Film Council. It's one of the many, it's not the same Korean Film Council that I think contemporary scholars think of, it's an older version of that, but it's one of the many organizations that would later be consolidated into the Motion Picture Association of Korea. Such organizations worked alongside the U.S. Army military government in Korea, which had begun regulating motion picture production and enacting film laws only months after Korea's liberation from Japan. So as you can see here, during the first 2 years of the Korean War, lots and lots of newsreels, or non-fictional documentary shorts and features were being made by the U.S. Information Service, which is an outgrowth of the 502nd Military Unit Station in Jinhae. However, between 1950 and 1951, only 10 South Korean films were shepherded through production. So about a year and a half, only 10 films were made. And they were taken through the steps of production, distribution, and exhibition by the Korean Film Union, the KFU, which, unlike the better-equipped American Bureau, really had to contend with severe shortages of film stock and 16mm cameras and other equipment, while converting basically public bathhouses into developing labs. So they sort of had to make do with what was available. The country was already pretty devastated by the war. Not until the 1952 production of Yoon's Sungbul Temple, Sungbul Sa, did a fictional work provide the kind of dramatic backdrop worthy of the war by extending the nation's cinematic vocabulary into new psychologically complex and morally ambiguous territory. And its plot, I don't really have an image from the film to show you, but you'll have to just bear with me as I explain the plot very briefly. It focuses on a man who feigns sickness to dodge army service and seek refuge in quieter environs of a Buddhist temple, only to eventually do the quote-unquote right thing in the end and return to the front lines. According to documentation, it appears that Imani did see this film on one of his furloughs, and it was very inspirational to him. And I think the complexity of its themes will sort of bear out later when we get to his own features. So, taking their cue from fiction writers such as Hwang Sun-won, whose 1953 short story Cranes, I'm sure some of you are familiar with, concerns 2 friends separated by the war and seeking reconciliation, inspired by a host of literary texts, including those kind of short stories. Several of the films were made by Yoon Bong-joon and other directors in 1954 and 1955, began allegorizing colonial legacies and national division through images of fractured families whose wounds and abiding pain sprang from ideological fissures that had erupted well before the North Korean People's Army blitzed across the 38th parallel on June 25th, 1950. Now, getting back to Imani, because I've taken this far away from Imani, it seems, upon completion of his military service in 1955, 2 years after the signing of the Armistice Agreement between North and South, He resumed his gravitation toward the cinematic and dramatic arts. And I say dramatic arts because he was also sort of itching to be an actor as well. He wasn't just bitten by the directing bug, or eager to get behind the lens. He also wanted to appear in front of the camera. And he actually enrolled in an acting school for a period, and then he joined a theater group. And then he began writing scenarios and short screenplays. It just so happened that he was living in a neighborhood, his house was next door to a filmmaker, and he was able to sort of finagle his way into his house and show him his script, and that's how he sort of opened literal and figurative doors in his own career. And so as he's meeting these established film directors, he's sort of demonstrating his ability as a writer and potentially as a director. And eventually, those directors gave him a shot, both in front of the camera and behind the lens, as you can see here. He had small bit roles as an actor in films like the 1956 period piece, The Tragic Prince. And he landed some assistant directing gigs on productions like A Rickshaw from 1960. And all those experiences really helped Imani to earn the experience needed to direct his own feature-length debut a year later. And that film is titled Kaleidoscope. Starring someone you might recognize, some of you at least, the legendary Kim Sung-ho, very famous figure from that period in Korean cinema. Kaleidoscope, so that's his directorial debut. Both the plot and the title of that film seem to anticipate subsequent events in Imani's life and career. I'll keep it very brief here, but the film's plot concerns basically a conflict between a male protagonist's first and second wives. And so they're sort of going at each other verbally and non-verbally throughout the film. And that seems to anticipate some of his own marital problems. Let's say he had a very tumultuous domestic life across 2 marriages. All the evidence and the oral history seem to support the idea that while Imani is a fantastic filmmaker, he loved to go to the Chung and make films, drink after hours with his buddies from the film set. He was not very often at home, and he was a very absent father and husband. And so this led to a lot of marital spats, I think, and he had some real crises in his relationships. So we have to sort of think about that in relation to just how prolific he was as a filmmaker. He achieved that tremendous output at a great cost, some would say. Both the plot, and as I said, both the plot and the title seem to anticipate. The title, Kaleidoscope, for me at least, it seems to hint at the, if you will, kaleidoscopic array of subjects and genres that would emerge within his oeuvre over the next 15 years, leading up to the posthumous release of what I think is his greatest film, The Road to Sampo in 1975. Between 1961 and 1975, Imani directed 51 features. That's 51 films in 15 years. It's a remarkable feat. I do have to just put this into context. He's not the only one making films at that rate. Im Kwon-taek, who starts his career at the same time, 1961, he's basically the same age, 2 years older, I think. Im Kwon-taek is making the same number of films within that same time period. The thing is, of course, he's going to continue making films into the 70s, 80s, Taebaek Mountains, and Gilsotum, and Sopyeonjae, Junyang, all the films that Im Kwon-taek became known for in the August years, which Imani didn't have the ability to do, obviously. So, yes, he's making a lot of films, but so too are Shin Sang-ok, and so too are Yoo Hyun-mok, and all the other filmmakers you've heard reference to. So he wasn't alone, but he wasn't alone in suffering severe regulations, and that's something that I think is worth pointing out. He had limitations placed on his body of work by the authorities, and by which I mean guidelines issued by the POC administration that affected cinema in every way. It affected cinema aesthetically, narratively, generically, and economically. But those regulations were especially vexatious for Imani. He's the director of a lot of war films, I think I've already pointed out. Films like Until I Die from '62 and A Soldier Without a Serial Number from 1966. A lot of war films that attempted to present what I would say are subtle alternatives to the dichotomous portrayal of South Koreans as virtuous and communists as merciless. I think he didn't have a black and white view of that conflict from personal experience, and I think that's borne out in the films that he made, which are a little bit more subtle, dare I say, than some of the output of, say, Shin Sang-ok, on those grounds at least. As some of you know, and this is perhaps one of the more fascinating aspects of his career, Imani was arrested for making a film, 7 Female Prisoners, in 1965, which adopted what was perceived to be a pro-communist slant, or stance. it's not really a pro-communist film, but Park Geun-hye's regime seemed to look upon it as such. The film revolves around an officer in the KPA who kills a Chinese guard after witnessing him attempt to rape a group of female POWs. And the officer subsequently grapples with psychological uncertainty before ultimately defecting to the South. And because the officer, whom the female prisoners thank, was depicted as a three-dimensional character, Lee Man-hee was accused of breaking the anti-communist law, which denounced any sympathetic treatment of North Koreans. Authorities confiscated prints of the film. It was taken out of theaters. It was re-edited by the authorities and put back into theaters under a different title. And basically, Lee Man-hee wiped his hands of the film. He didn't want anything to do with the re-release version. He was actually imprisoned for 40 days by the Park administration. And this brings me back, okay, so that's a very heated part of his career, but it's something that's going to be repeated, not only in his career, in other filmmakers' works as well, or their careers as well. Yoo Hyun Mook is another filmmaker you've heard reference to, and he's someone who endured harsh restrictions and potential jail time as a result of a film he made in 1964-65, Empty Dream, Chunmon, or Spring Dream, I guess, and just look it up, Google it, Empty Dream, Yoo Hyun Mook. It's a scandalous film. It was considered to be explicit, graphic, sexually, and it pushed buttons in the way that no other Korean film had before, and he was forced to recant or retract the film, pull it out of theaters, and it was essentially taken out of theatrical distribution because of its content. So, let's get back to Lee Man-hee. I keep going off on tangents with other filmmakers. Lee Man-hee, and what I think is his crowning achievement, apart from The Road to Sampo, and that's The Marines Who Never Return. While ostensibly towing the anti-communist line, Lee Man-hee's elegiac tribute to Marines treats the subject of the Korean War with intelligence and sensitivity. And for someone who, like myself, grew up watching American Korean War films when I was a teenager, getting into college, it was really refreshing to see a very different perspective that didn't sort of stereotypically reduce Koreans on either side to stick figures. So it's a very intelligent, sensitive war drama, but it's also a generically promiscuous film. It sort of moves in a lot of directions. It's musical at times, it's a comedy at times. And it dares to show his doomed heroes questioning the legitimacy of the war while weeping uncontrollably in the trenches. It's shot in a visceral, camera-rattling style that would rival that of Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan. In fact, the opening scene, which is it's Incheon landing invasion, it kind of reminds me of a lot of D-Day films or Omaha beach landing sequences in films that you're probably familiar with, like The Longest Day. And this film, this ensemble film, really paved the way for his slightly less visually dynamic, though equally heartfelt examinations of spiritual innocence, moral conviction, and political culpability, beginning with The Men of YMS 504. A bona fide depiction of naval warfare that lingers on the everyday details and human conflicts that arise between officers and enlisted men. And like his 1964 features Chaser and Intimidator, which are also about friendship, they're about betrayal, about failed revenge, The Men of YMS 504 shows Lee Man-hee gravitating toward allegorical stories in which critical inquiries about the validity of the war are couched within formulaic frameworks that mask their incendiary potential. And had I more time, I would try to better explain what makes this film so extraordinary. So, I said promiscuous in its intermixing of genres. It's dipping into the semantic basis of melodrama, the romance, the buddy film, comedy. At a certain point, it becomes a film noir thriller. It becomes a gangster film in a certain scene, and it actually turns into a musical, a full-on musical. So it is quite unusual, you would think, but in fact, a lot of films from that period are equally promiscuous in their mixing of genres, the genre elements. And despite this image, this is an image that I took off my television screen. This is one of those VHS tapes that I received. I don't know if it was I don't think it's ever been distributed on home video formats. So it doesn't look very good there, quality-wise. But despite what you see, it seems to suggest a very frivolous type of naval movie. It actually ends on a deeply moving note. It follows the ending immediately follows after the protagonist of the film has died a heroic death in battle. And the main character's sister and son, I don't have the image, but you have to imagine his sister, a woman in her 30s, and his son are gathering at his grave to honor his memory. And the 5-year-old boy, whose mother has deserted him, cries, "Why did my father die?" And that question, which continues to haunt South Korean cinema, goes notably unanswered in the film. Why did my father die? There's no answer to that question. And so the Men of YMS 504 sort of ends with the poignant image of a fatherless child. Presumably that child is going to be taken care of by a new family, maybe a more emotionally anchored family. But I do think it's significant that The Marines Who Never Return begins with a similar image. The film sort of leads us into conflict and war through the image of a young girl. It's in the aftermath of an amphibious landing, as I said, at Incheon. A group of Marines scrimmages with a platoon of North Korean soldiers. They're sending a volley of bullets across a desolate courtyard. And caught in the middle of this gunfire are a woman and her young daughter. As she runs toward the South Koreans, the woman is gunned down, as you can see. And it leaves the girl sort of stunned. She's momentarily stunned. She doesn't know how to react. She begins crying over her mother's body. And I would say that the stranded child could be said to represent a number of different things. And I don't want to unnecessarily allegorize the image, but I do think it's worth pointing out that people have suggested that the child represents the in-between status of most civilians during that time, during the Seesaw Korean War. Men, women, and children who were put into compromised positions and forced to take sides. And by extension, the girl's liminal position might be understood as a metaphor for the Korean nation, caught between two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, negotiating the future of a country that meant little to either before its bifurcation. Couched within a textual and syntactical framework, that moment reflects the indeterminate status of this film, The Marines Who Never Return. A war film that wavers between generic thresholds, as I said, musical, melodrama, comedy, and at least towards the end appears uncertain in its political affiliations. And this is what's sort of scandalous about the film. There's some real questioning of the moral certainty with which these men are committing their lives. So it questions directly the mandate, the political and moral mandate of participating in war. After saving the girl and rooting out the remaining foes, who, by the way, they climb up to in the early section of the film, the foes, North Koreans in this case, are climbing up to the rafters of a shelled building because, as one soldier surmises, it's closer to heaven. They're going up to the rafters because it's going to get them to heaven sooner. The Marines, they adopt this waif, this young girl named Young-yi. And then at that point, she becomes kind of a mascot for this bunch of men. She's a reminder, in a way, of the happiness, potentially the happiness that awaits them if they survive the next mission. And it's significant that the next mission, which is the capper of the film, the 20-minute conclusion to the film, is a frontline defense against Chinese attack. So it shifts from North Korean to Chinese attackers. And that final skirmish, which notably replaces the North Koreans with Chinese, of course that foregoes the fratricidal implications of warfare, consumes, as I said, the last 20 minutes of the film. It's just this spectacular scene of bloodletting and gunfire and military heroics leavened with a kind of consideration of the moral vacancy of this act, as you'll see in just a moment. And so together, those two epic battle sequences, which send mud flying at the camera and live bullets. They were shooting live bullets during the making of this film. In fact, Imani got injured by a bullet making the film. Those sequences bookend a narrative of loss, bereavement, and perseverance. And those are themes that I think congeal into really tangible signifiers through this image of the young girl. She just keeps coming back and back throughout the narrative. So you get these intimate and emotionally volatile scenes, as well as musical and comical interludes. Those are sandwiched between two spectacular sequences of bloodletting. It creates a typically discombobulating, you can't really tell here, it looks like it's a combat scene. This is just the men getting on top of each other's shoulders and playing horse, essentially, a big version of stacked horse. And they're biting at each other, and they're tickling each other, and they're laughing. This follows just a minute or two after a major scene of bloodletting. So it's a very discombobulating experience watching these films, but it's a wholly appropriate rhythm that's salient within, if not exclusive to South Korean cinema. Past and present, I would say that I experienced that discombobulation tonally and rhythmically in contemporary Korean films as well. Scenes of the men playfully wrestling and biting one another are harshly juxtaposed with these slow tracking shots of massacred civilians. 15 minutes into the film, a Marine breaks down after spotting his sister's body among the dead villagers. And then grief starts to multiply. It spreads like wildfire. And it can't be extinguished by the men's profusely wept tears or the bounteous amounts of rice alcohol that they consume in an otherwise festival McHugh Lee party in the barracks where the men toast the young girl. And this is actually a slightly different scene. This is when U.S. military soldiers arrive bearing, as you would often see, gifts. And they're actually trying to visit the people at a brothel, the young women who are serving clients, American clients primarily, and they come bearing gifts and chocolates. It's a very typical kind of representation. But the young girl's centrality to the narrative, I don't think should be underestimated. It's important she assigns the men their names, okay? And for the most part, we don't know their actual names, but she assigns them nicknames, so Skinny, Toad, Big Nose, Harry, Sister, Tiger. And that's how we come to know them, through her lens. And I would also say that she's significant because of her own multivalent relationship to the men. She has different kinds of relationships with the men. In a certain sense, the young man, the Marine who lost his sister, who sees his sister among the pile of dead bodies, well, Young-yi, the young girl, becomes a substitute for the missing sister, and they call one another brother and sister, and it's a very odd scene, oppa. And then we get uni and oppa a lot in this film. It's a very unusual thing. And only two of the men's names, their actual names, are mentioned. So Chung, the Marine who is more often referred to as oppa, elder brother, and Private Che, you can see here, whose own brother, a North Korean sympathizer, is responsible for the death of Chung-ik's sister. So there's the melodramatic, almost Shinpa-style melodrama elements. This emphasis on descriptive nicknaming or sobriquets resonates with the process, I would argue, of genreification, because what genreification, at least partially, is, it's about assigning categorical determinants. And what are the names of, what are these things? Can we name them? And so I would say it resonates with genreification. It's a connection supported by the fact that the two newcomers to the unit, these are privates played by Kim Hyun, who you see here. Do any of you recognize him, by the way? He's such a famous individual from that period. And then Gubong-soo, who is also a very, Gubong-so, sorry, who is also a very famous comic actor in a lot of 1950s and 60s films. And the fact that they're coexisting in the same film tells you about the sort of split generic heritage. It's both a drama and a comedy whenever they're on screen. As the narrative shuttles between those generic registers, between the sentimentality of someone who fights so that we can live in a war-free world, and the chutzpah of a happy-go-lucky soldier who joined the Marines strictly for exercise and adventure. His whole reason for being in this is because he wants to have adventure in his life. I think as we move between those registers, we're asked to consider the deeper implications of split family loyalties. The coexistence of melodrama and comedy thus sanctions the reconciliation of Chung-ik, who initially wanted to avenge his dead sister, and Private Che, who, because he bears a striking resemblance to his brother, carries the burden of guilt and responsibility. So at two decisive junctures during their battle with the Chinese invaders, members of the unit mention the importance of being the Marines who return, and that's where we get the title. And the title can be interpreted a few different ways. But in the final scene, there you can see the battalion leader, Tiger is his name. He reports that 39 of the 42-man unit have perished. So 39 of the 42-man unit, they're dead. And it emphasizes their failure to make good on an earlier promise to the girl. They promised Young-hee that they would return. In fact, one Marine does return to her, and it's a milquetoast radio operator named Uni, sister, who risked his life to convey his battalion's need for reinforcements. And when Sister limps back to the base, the orphan girl immediately asks him, why didn't they come back? But because he's been sort of explicitly and pejoratively linked to a kind of enfeebled form of male femininity, there's a troubling suggestion that Sister does not count as a true Marine, that his return is of little consequence compared to that of others. But this is complicated, I would say, because the other two survivors, Tough Guy Tiger and Private Che, are themselves sort of emasculated in a very formulaic and traditional way at the end. So we see them emerging from their foxhole. They're beaten and bloody. They have survived, though, and the men begin weeping profusely. This is something you would traditionally see in women's melodramas at that time. And it's a symptom, perhaps, of post-traumatic stress disorder, but it's also just as likely an indication that Korean masculinity is a lot more fluid and amorphous than originally envisaged, which gives me great hope. We don't see that. We see a much more kind of delineated type of masculinity in American motion pictures. And just to wrap up, before this is the very final scenes of the film. Before the two Marines amble off together hand in hand, Tiger tearfully implores his partner, "Show me your tender smile." That's what he says, "Show me your tender smile." And this request would not seem out of place in a romance or a melodrama, but it casts new light on the homosocial bonding in this and other war films that Nahmee made. Whereas Kim Ki-duk's film Five Marines ends with only one man surviving, Nahmee's film culminates with the constitution of a couple, a pair of survivors whose homecoming is nevertheless thwarted and displaced unto that of sister. But by not showing the couple returning to the arms of young Yi, by refusing to bring closure to this tale of national sorrow, the film leaves the audience in a kind of present tense limbo, not unlike the precarious position that the orphan girl occupied at the beginning of the film. Situated on a precipice of time overlooking what might be, we presume that these two survivors could return, or they would return, were it not for the historical obstacles stacked against them. And this is the true temporality of the film. And indeed of the Korean War. That is the time, the sort of chronotopic feature of the Korean War. It's a temporality of imminent, never consummated arrival, a pending time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was a really very interesting talk. And we'll get everyone together after everyone speaks to have Q&A. All right, so next is Irhe Sohn. He's a historian of Korean film and media at Smith College. He's currently writing a manuscript of his first book entitled Promises of Failure, Dreams of Cinema in Colonial Korea, which investigates the formation of colonial Korean cinema during the height of Japanese colonialism through the lens of constant failure. The title of his talk is Rethinking the Golden Age with a Female Judge and Homage. I will leave it to you.
Thank you so much for your introduction, Dr. Reizman. So my name is Irhe Sohn, and I'm really grateful to be here to share my perspective about the South Korean Golden Age cinema. And I'm really grateful to GYOPO to put so much time and energy into making this wonderful event. I feel so honored to be part of this. So today I would like to introduce, so my goal is very low because this is my I'm very at the very early stage of kind of doing some research about this fantastic movie. So my goal is to introduce this woman filmmaker who has been relatively unknown outside of Korea, or even in Korea as well, compared to her male counterparts like Kim Ki-young, Shin Sang-ho, Han Hyung-mo, and Nahmee, and so on. So her name is, can you please, next slide please. Next slide please. Sorry. Okay. One back, please. Yeah, thanks you. So her name is Hong Eun-won, and she was the second woman to be a film director in South Korea after Park Nam-ok, whose first and last feature film was released in 1954. So my talk revolves around her debut feature, 1962 film, A Female Judge. Since I'm at the very early stage of conducting more thorough research about her career, this talk may fall short of any substantial theoretical or historical contribution, but I hope this talk will help generate more questions about South Korean cinema's 1960s, namely the Golden Age, not only their contemporary social, cultural, political landscape, but also today's conditions under which we rediscover this Golden Age, how Golden Age is named, rediscovered, and reconfigured. So let me just meander a bit to set up the background for the discussion of this movie. Next, please. So the quote-unquote Golden Age of Korean cinema is a celebratory name that refers to a period between the mid-1950s and early 1970s. And according to Kathleen McHugh, who moderated on the panel yesterday, and Nancy Aimless, who edited this volume, South Korean Golden Age Melodrama, which was the first English language collection of the academic works regarding the era. The Golden Age is characterized by a number of South Korean directors who produced a body of work as historically, aesthetically, and politically significant as that of other well-known national film movements, such as Italian Neorealism, French New Wave, and New German cinema. So while these national film movements in Europe have garnered so much attention, making their ways into the syllabi of Intro Film and Media Studies, for example, Korea's Golden Age cinema was not properly introduced to audiences outside of Korea. So McHugh and Reizman noted that their first impulse of editing the 2006 book was to introduce readers to this remarkable body of the Golden Age films as the antecedent of the current Renaissance, which means the new Korean cinema rising up in the early 2000s, the beginning of all this happening today, right? Like Bong Joon-ho and Park Chan-wook. To this day, when South Korean cinema is known globally, its past has not received much deserved attention. So this week's symposium and the film series at LACMA would mark a great effort to have these films exposed to a wider audience. But as we discuss the achievement during the golden era of South Korean cinema in the 1960s, I want us to pause a moment to contemplate upon what golden age would mean. This has been touched upon by Professor Chung earlier in the conversation. So the era was claimed to be a golden age as early as 1969, when Korean film historians like Lee Young-il published a comprehensive history of Korean cinema as part of the celebration of its 50th anniversary. Already at the dawn of the 1970s, Koreans acknowledged the significance of artistic, industrial development in the nation. Next, please. However, by the early 2000s, when young generation of Korean film scholars, along with Kathleen McHugh and Darcy Paquet, initiated the discussion of Korean cinema's past, the golden age of Korean cinema may have felt rather unfamiliar to many Koreans until 2000. Until those films by now acclaimed directors such as Bong Joon-ho, Park Chan-wook, Im Sun-ye gained passionate responses from their domestic audiences, partly coming from this vibrant film culture. Next, please. And until the so-called South Korean blockbuster movies such as Shiri, which was touched upon by Professor Different right before, Shiri drew attention to the potentiality of this culture industry. Korean films had been generally perceived to be vulgar and inferior throughout the history compared to European art film or Hollywood blockbusters. But then the name of the 1960s golden age made its return with the rise of new Korean cinema in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Next, please. For example, as Professor Kim mentioned yesterday about The Housemaid, Kim Gi-young and his film The Housemaid were a discovery in the 1990s by the avid group of cinephiles, along with other great movies of the era. These films had long been inaccessible, if not totally forgotten. Though through the popularization of personalized media such as VHS and DVD, the Korean audience began watching Korean movies from the 1960s as if they had come from a foreign country. They became enthusiastic about the visions that those films exhibited, and the 1997 Busan International Film Festival's Kim Gi-young retrospective was the culmination of such movement. Next, please. Yeah. And this phenomenon was calling for a reinterpretation of Korean film history from the perspective of the 2000s. Still, the access to the film of the past is a constant issue when it comes to Korean film history studies. Until the Korean Film Archive was officially established in 1974, films were not necessarily considered as an object worthy of preservation. On top of that, the long-standing undervaluation of Korean films caused the loss of so many important films. Also, many of the existing film prints are not complete on their own, so examining them, their visions of a film may require a researcher's acrobatics to look into its multiple versions of script, fragmented film print, and historical reviews and discourses. Next, please. So even the Housemaid did not have the full set of negative reels, so the version that's circulating today in digital copy results from the pastiche of best quality pictures from multiple different prints. Even the 15-minute scenes, next please, within the current version was drawn from a print shown at an international film festival, so restoration specialists had to spend much time on removing the hard-coded English subtitles from each frame. For the name of the Golden Age to become the currency of the academic and critical world, it took a concerted effort among film fans, historians, and archivists and preservationists in and outside of Korea. This gets us this question about the return of history. In what ways has the Golden Age made its return to this century? Under what conditions do we get to have the urge and momentum to investigate the past? Next, please. So while such films as Housemaid, Man of Freedom, and Mother and a Guest are great films that exhibit these unique artistic visions with full of fascinating stories about their dynamic interaction with society and the audiences, I would suggest that we acknowledge this specific cultural, discursive, institutional conditions under which these films survived despite the general decline of the industry in the 1980s and made their glamorous way back into the history. The Golden Age is as much a construct produced by today's academic and critical discourses as it is a testimony to the vibrancy of the film industry in the 1960s. Next, please. A Female Judge, released in 1962, was part of that vibrancy, while at the same time, it has not received its deserving attention for so long. This may apply to other women filmmakers in the era, not only the directors, but also so many of whom were involved in the making of cinema in different roles. This is partly due to the sheer number of women directors in South Korea until the 1970s, when there had only been 4 women directors. And this does tell us a great deal about the male dominance in the industry and the male-oriented discourses in historiography. Next, please. In the early 2000s, feminist film scholars made attempts to revive Hong Eun-won's legacy along with the rise of the discourse about the 1960s Korean cinema. However, none of her films were available until very recently. The lack of film print is certainly not an auspicious situation for the women directors' work to receive a chance to be reevaluated as part of the Golden Age. So scholars had to rely on the existing film script, which may not be the same as the actual film, and some other discursive evidence such as reviews, memoirs, and interviews. And this is one of the collections that brought together all the kind of reviews and Hong Eun-won's own writings and some of the scenarios that she wrote for other projects. Next, please. Then the film print of A Female Judge unexpectedly reappeared in 2015, very recently, giving us a new momentum for the study of Hong's career as a film director. What happened was this. So in 2015, Han Ju-ho, who was the president of Yonhap Film Corporation, donated to the Korean Film Archive more than 700 film prints that he used for mobile screening events. Among them was this long-missing film by Hong, A Female Judge. Although it was in the format of 16mm print with some missing reels and frames extremely deteriorated by countless screenings, and the bad condition of the garage, as you can see here, they were stored until the Korean Film Archive's acquisition. It was still a fortunate discovery. Then, A Female Judge was shown at Seoul International Women's Film Festival in 2016 for the first time after decades, accompanied with a special performance by actress Han Ye-ri, who reinterpreted the film's final plea, the final plea of the film's main character to represent her mother-in-law. So now the film is made available digitally online through the Korean Film Archive's YouTube channel. I mean, it's not enough to highlight how many times, how it is incredible to have that YouTube channel, so you can have immediate access to all the great films with English subtitles. So if you get interested after this talk, please go to the YouTube channel and watch it. Next, please. Hong has been in the film world for a long time before making her debut, having experienced film production in 1948 at the age of 26. She began working in the film world in full swing as a scriptwriter, script supervisor, and assistant director from 1954. Her colleagues considered her film script to be sophisticated with humor and elegance, and they also testified that unlike other scriptwriters who did not have much experience of actual film shooting, her writings included the helpful notes that prefigured the directing and editing. Next, please. Hong's already veteran status in the film industry by the time A Female Judge was released in 1962 urged one critic at the time to note that her debut was, quote-unquote, felt pretty late compared to her splendid resume. Next, please. So I don't have much access to the actual box office records, which has not been systematically collected back then, but A Female Judge seems to have received much attention at the time, partly due to this rare case of a woman director in the early 1960s. In many cases, attention just stopped by simply noting how rare it was that a woman took a leading position in film production, and many articles about her debut in 1962 referred to her as, quote-unquote, a single red dot, a figurative set phrase in Korean to refer to the only woman in a male-dominated society or group. Hong Eun-won, as a single red dot in the film world, had also resonated with her debut film's protagonist, who is another single red dot in court as a judge. So Female Judge is based on the actual death case of Hwang Yun-seok, who was appointed as a judge at Seoul District Court in 1952, the first as a woman in South Korea. So on April 20th in 1961, Judge Hwang had just a usual day at work and returned home. And the next day, she was discovered unconscious and then died in hospital. The police speculated that her mother-in-law was the culprit. Mother-in-law poisoned her. But the autopsy didn't show any toxic chemical from her body. And then her husband was also accused for abandonment causing death and sentenced for time in prison. And then he was then acquitted at the appealing court. So this became the unresolved case. And then it quickly became the talk of the nation, creating so many speculations about her death, while still it remains a mystery. Unlike this tragic ending and mystery about Judge Hwang's life, Hong's film simply takes it as a narrative element to seek for a happy ending for its protagonist, Jin-suk. The film's beginning is missing in the existing print, but according to the film script, A Female Judge begins with a small conflict between Jin-suk's mother and Mr. Che, who later becomes Jin-suk's in-law. When Che's car crashes into her mother's street noodle cart, so Mr. Che stubbornly denies his liability. Jin-suk steps forward to demand an appropriate measure to repair the cart, displaying her knowledge of law. So Mr. Che acquiesces to his fault finally and asks Jin-suk's mother with a satisfying smile if she is her daughter. So this successful businessman became curious about this young and intelligent woman. Next, please. Jin-suk has been preparing for a judicial exam with a great ambition to become a judge, according to her own statement in the movie, to cure women's heart just as a doctor cures the sick. Her supportive father arranges her stay in the temple where she can find a less distracting environment for her study. Here I would like to compare this scene of a conversation in the existing film script and the movie that is now available to us. I'm doing this comparison because the film was not based on her original script, despite Hong's proven skill as a scriptwriter. So when Hong accepted the director position of this movie, she is said to have agreed on the condition that she had the liberty to change the script as she wanted. So of course the film script and film, as a final product is always kind of different, or always different. But given Hong's commitment and request for authority as a director, we may assume the difference between them in the case of this film as Hong's own directorial intervention. So this scene is designated as the scene number 6, located at Hyeogyang, Jin-suk's father's house, in the script. The script doesn't have any extra guiding text on the setting or acting or editing, except that Jin-suk and her parents are together in the frame. And the conversation happens just between the father and mother, with no single word from Jin-suk. The father complaining about his wife's peddler job, and mother complaining about their life after father's retirement, and Jin-suk just studying. And when the father called Jin-suk to make that suggestion, to which she does not respond in the script, the mother expresses much concern about sending her daughter alone to the temple. So what is missing in this script is Jin-suk's reaction to this conversation between her parents. It is as if it were to be shot as it had been written, Jin-suk might have just been sitting between them silently and obediently listening to them. But in the film, Jin-suk has a little more interactive agency. Let's just watch the scene briefly together. The sound is not out.
테니 그 먹고 살 방책이나 좀 차려보구려.
아 설마 산일이 거미줄 칠까?
아이 그걸 말씀이라고 하고 계시오. 그 쥐꼬리만한 월급도 이젠 구경도 못하게 됐는데 저것만 방심이는 배가 불러준답니까?
나 참 이거. 얘 진수가.
네?
너 암만 해도 안 되겠다. 너 어머니가 저기 하다니 공부가 되겠니? 내 편지 가지고 절로 가서 아주 집에일 있고 공부해야지.
아니 다 큰 게 집에를 혼자 절로 보내시면 어떡하시려고 그러는 거예요?
아 당신은 이 시대를 키우면서도 자식의 성격 하나도 파악 못하는구려.
어머니 염려 마세요. 시험이 패스될 때까지는 전 여자가 아니에요. 죽어도 합격해야지 돼요.
In this scene, we see Jin-suk's parents in the foreground, while Jin-suk sits at her desk sideways in the background. As her father calls her, Jin-suk comes to the foreground and sits between her parents. And to her mother worrying about the daughter, she says, "Until I pass the exam, I'm no woman." Next, please. As an addition to the film script, Jin-suk's remark in the film about her being no woman until she achieves her goal is a very intriguing choice, I think. On the one hand, this reminds us of the expectation given to women who pursue an uncharted path in public life, that they must prove themselves as equal to their male counterparts in terms of the qualification of the job, not relying on any minority argument. On the other hand, what also draws my attention in this condition, until I pass the exam, if she is supposed to show her intelligence parallel to or even better than man, wouldn't that still required after she becomes a judge? Why making it a temporary condition for that to give up her womanhood? So maybe I'm thinking too much on this, but as a reference, let's see another clip from the movie. Here she successfully passes the exam and becomes appointed as a judge. And then she immediately came under this media attention.
세월을 두고 불행했던 이 나라 여성들의 습관을 메스로 수술하는 의사 못지않게 수술하고 싶었어요.
So at the end of this brief shot of her revealing her aspiration to the media was added this weird sound effect calling the female judge 4 times, echoing from the outside of the frame. And this non-diegetic sound refers to the media attention she is receiving as a female judge, a title that was so uncommon that it may have become the social pressure. But at the same time, the eeriness of this hysterically sounding echo seems to bring womanhood back to Jin-suk. How and why has she become a woman again that she has given up until her success in the exam? What would it mean that a woman who neglected her womanhood for her success becomes a woman again because of her success? So this provisional cause, until I pass the exam, does not represent Jin-sook's determination, but the very condition or a destiny of a woman who ventures into man's world. She is a judge who is a woman, but at the same time she is a woman who is a judge. Maybe Director Hong had a similar experience with such a dual standard. Next, please. So when introducing Hong to the public, male writers often praised her for having both male and female qualities as a worker in the industry. She has the courageous heart with which to swim across the roaring current of the film world, making men look rather small. But at the same time, she has this delicate and sophisticated sensibility as a woman to contribute to the film industry in Korea. So this dual standard, not known today's women across the world, encapsulates what comes next for Jin-sook's struggle as a woman in private life and as a judge in public life. Next, please. Let's go further into the story. So leaving her pre-existing boyfriend who does not approve a woman's success in public life, Jin-sook continues to pursue her career with a more stable financial support from Mr. Che by getting married to his son, Kyusik. So far, this story of Jin-sook's success seems like a gender reversal of a common narrative of a poor man's success. That is, a self-made man who arises from poverty with his own intelligence and hardworking, which enables this arrangement of marriage to a wealthy and powerful man's daughter that will cement his upward mobility. So likewise, Jin-sook becomes the part of this wealthy and powerful family through her own success in her exam. But what comes next is far more different than the story of a poor man's success, or rather painful reality as a woman/judge. Her public life is not easily balanced with her private life that demands the role of a woman in the household. Next, please. Oh, can you go first? Yeah, here. Her husband, who's already feeling inferior to Jin-sook, grunts at her constantly being not so supportive as his wife, and he ends up having an affair with a secretary in his office. Next, please. Moreover, except for her father-in-law, who is supportive, the rest of her in-laws disapprove of her success because of Jin-sook's winning, probably a winning of the full heart of Mr. Che, their patriarch. Constantly being compared to Jin-sook by her own father, the sister-in-law is not only jealous of her, but also intercepts the bribe that came to Jin-sook, which she wouldn't receive. Next, please. The mother-in-law, putting her own children before Jin-sook, keeps lamenting herself having to aid her daughter-in-law when she believes that the daughter-in-law should be the one who serves her. Juggling her family and her work, Jin-sook gets exhausted physically and emotionally. When she figures out that she is pregnant, she decides to retire from public life, to public service, to spend more time with family, and instead practice law as an attorney. To this news, her husband becomes elated. Next, please. Then, before this happiness is in this family, the murder case occurs. Jin-sook's grandmother-in-law dies after drinking a cup of poison juice. So police identify the mother-in-law as the suspect, and curiously, she does not deny the charge. Jin-sook, who still believes there are something more to the case, volunteers as her in-law's defense attorney, successfully representing her in the court. So what is revealed through Jin-sook's own investigation was that the poison drink was brought to Mr. Che's home by a man who's not part of the family for his own suicide. And this unknown man was the son of the mother-in-law's first marriage, whom she had secretly supported and did not want to be known to any other family members. So the man was paying his last visit to his mother, Jin-sook's mother-in-law, to end his own life in front of her. But for some reason, he hurriedly had to leave the house, having already put the poison in his drink. And this unattended drink was unfortunately given to grandmother by innocent people, which caused her death. So in Jin-sook's final defense, she pleads for a compassion for the mother-in-law who has hid her son from the first marriage as a war widow in order to protect her new family. So next, please.
가장 선한 것이 가장 악한 것으로 오인되는 수가 있듯이 자식의 어진 양심은 아들에서 그 아들을 살리고 싶었고 행복한 가정에 아편 환자가 던지는 파문을 막고 싶었던 것입니다. 어리석은 모성이요 어리석은 양심이기는 합니다. 그러나 누가 이 피고인을 조소할 수 있으며 죄인이라고 돌을 던질 수가 있겠습니까? 재판장, 본 변호인은 세상이 주지하는 바 피고인의 며느리이며 살해된 시조모께서 나타나시지 않았더라면 직접 그 독약이 든 주스를 마셨을 피해자인 동시 검사의 논거에 따른다면 피고인을 가장 증오해야 할 처지에 있습니다. 그럼 본 변호인이 피고인을 변호하기 위하여 이 자리에 섰다는 것은 며느리인 본 변호인이 시어머니인 피고인의 어진 본성이 절대로 그런 무서운 사건을 저지를 인간이 아니라는 것을 믿었기 때문입니다.
Can you stop here? Yeah, so because it goes on and on, so I don't want to spend more time on this. So as a film led by a woman protagonist who practices law, the conflict of this story is resolved in the court. But at the same time, the court case is very much entangled with the problem arising from her family dynamic. A film scholar, Hyun Jae-ran, who has studied about Hong Eun-won even before her film was discovered, has once noted, quote, "The story's unfolding transforms the rift between mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law in a private space into a relationship between the accused and her lawyer. This may seem based on intentions too good to be true, but herein lies the reality of Korean society of the era." So while the film does not articulate it clearly, the mother-in-law's divided motherhood represents so many other women who were in the second marriage after losing their husband during the Korean War. And as we have seen from this scene, when Jin-suk begins her defense, what we see mostly on screen is not Jin-suk's authority as a lawyer, but the reactions of her in-laws, husband, the court audiences, and the judges. And her words are heard as if they were a voice calling for communal responsibility for the tragedy of the motherhood, not the mother's individual matter. This seems to resonate in the courtroom, making the point that the society was the culprit, not the mother-in-law. In other words, Jin-suk's resounding voice exposes the difficult reality for war widows whose problems cannot be resolved as a personal matter. So when the camera turns to her family for a grand speech about how society should be based on the belief in the human, next please. The audience reactions to her speech converges onto her straight posture in a black robe. Next please. Yeah. But also, so this happy ending is not just about restoring Jin-suk's relationship to her in-laws, but also about finally building the authority of this woman at law. So partly wishful ending envisioned by a woman filmmaker, Hong. Next please. So in the 2016 screening of the film at Seoul International Women's Film Festival, this final statement was rewritten to reflect the changes that happened in South Korean society over the decades. There, the actress Han Ye-ri, who appeared also in Minari, came up on stage as a reincarnation of Jin-suk in the 21st century. Unlike the fantasy of hope displayed in the movie, actress Han opened Jin-suk's statement with a question. So you are living in such a great world, but really, has women's life become better? And then she continued the legal defense, ending with this statement. Women have been the greatest victim of the history of violence and war over the millennia. Despite economic and physical exploitation, they have never ceased to stay in solidarity with the weak. Accused is innocent. If she has a sin, it is that she was born a woman who has been forced into oppression and sacrifice. Next, please. This reinterpretation of a female judge's court scene at the film festival was followed by a roundtable discussion among professional women who involved in making this performance, including actress Han Ye-ri, film director, and lawyer, and a judge, and the film festival programmer. So from each of their own career positions, they discussed the ordinary discrimination they have experienced in their professional life. And the answer to the question Han Ye-ri has raised to the audience in the performance beginning was rather discouraging and dismal. Director Im testified to the only choice the woman director had to make, like being an honorary man. Or actress Han Ye-ri also testified to her witnessing of the sexual harassment by male filmmakers, and lawyer Chung also kind of talked about how hard it was as a lawyer in this male-dominated legal field. Next, please. So after a female judge, the Kyung Hyun, this filmmaker, had more chances to direct her own movies. The Single Mom in 1964 and What Misunderstandings Left Behind in 1965. So compared to other more prolific male filmmakers in the era, just like Nahmee Lee, who produced like countless films, this was not a very much satisfying number. Right? But the pace of a film released every year or so may not be a sign of her career's decline as well. But for some reason unknown, her directorial filmography stopped with this third film. Next, please. And later she worked as a film writer, continuing her career in film production. And in 1976, when Hong had no longer any hope for returning as a film director, she submitted an essay reminiscing her works. It is entitled The Sadness of a Woman Film Director. And at the end of this essay, she wrote about her mixed feeling toward filmmaking in the form of a letter sent to a deceased director for whom she worked for as an assistant director. Next, please. So once director Yoo Do-yeon said, "Hong, even after you turn 60, I'm sure you will still run across the film world like a chipmunk and continue to sing like a canary. But is that still relevant for me? There is not a tiny space afforded for me to set my foot in filmmaking, and I'm even less than 50, let alone 60. The canary who forgot a song sends so many of her friends to the other world and never sings." And she also wrote about how she has this kind of expectation for her daughter to be successful, not in the film world, but in somewhere else. Next, please. And now we have another woman director, a fictional one, like a symbolic daughter who had devoted herself in filmmaking with more confidence. But this woman director is no confident at all. Her third feature film, Phantom People, has just been released, but soon will be taken down from the screen with many empty seats in the theater, like a ghost, or like fulfilled in the title. Next, please. To her, who's struggling to lead both her professional life and her family, a job is offered. A job is offered which is not promising much money, but is meaningful. So a direction of the dubbing direction of a dubbing to a 1960 film entitled A Female Judge, whose prints are deteriorated so much that some parts have lost their soundtrack, unlike the actual female judge. The film director's name was Hong Jae-won in this movie, a name irresistibly evoking Hong Hyun-won, the actual model. But this woman, who only left 3 films under her direction, did not leave much record in the film. Its film script also has been lost, so it takes difficult lip reading to restore the conversations. Moreover, the film seems to have so many missing parts, partly due to the censorship, and the task of the woman filmmaker to restore this ruined film leads to a journey following in the shadow of Hong Jae-won. Next, please. A literal shadow that signifies Hong's phantom cinema, a cinema we know that did exist, but now only exists in the form of a ghost. And in this haunted journey, the woman director in 2022 immediately finds the resonance between Hong and herself. So meeting so many people in the investigation, she could bring more pieces of the puzzle of a female judge. Although the puzzle is still incomplete, the film still vividly captures the dream of cinema that has been long forgotten, along with the woman filmmaker from the 60s. Next, please. So this is a summary of the 2020 movie Homage by Shin Soo-won, a contemporary woman director. And this fictional woman director's discovery of the unexpected genealogy in Homage discloses the destiny of the film as a textual bearer of stories untold, as a trace of painful yet exuberant experiences behind its making, and as a fragile material vulnerable to decay in time, decay in memory. The fictional director in Homage walks into the forgotten or lost part of the golden age, but what she discovers is not a glory. Hong's footsteps, discovered in Homage, leave the mark of frustration in the systematic male dominance, and the brutal future of a woman filmmaker would remain like a shadow or a ghost. Next. So Shin Soo-won's film Homage shows that remembering Korean women's phantom cinema, such as Hong Eun-won's, is not just about bringing the pieces of the puzzle together to present a comprehensive picture, or about restoring the lineage of women filmmakers. It is to acknowledge the painful failure that involved in women's work in the film industry, and even more painful failure of ours who have lost any continuous genealogy. So therefore, despite all the remarks about the achievement and success of the era's films, the golden age of South Korean cinema is not a name of triumph. It's the name of those that survived above all the remnants of failure. Therefore, before celebrating the past with a decorated name, we would need to remember the ruins, mull over the ways how to make sense out of them, and dwell in the critiques that those half-voiced objects murmur to us. That's one of the lessons we get from examining female judges and so many other filmmakers' work. Thank you for listening, and thank you so much for running the slide.
Okay, amazing. Let's see, I think we're rapidly running out of time. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to our last speaker. Do we have Darcy on Zoom? If someone could help me. What was that?
You can introduce him.
All right.
He'll be projecting.
Okay, good. All right. Okay, so our next speaker is Darcy Paquet. I hope I'm saying that correctly. He teaches at Busan Asian Film Festival. I'm sorry, not the festival. Busan Asian Film School, and is the author of New Korean Cinema, Breaking the Waves. He has curated several retrospectives of Korean cinema for the Udine Far East Film Festival, and has done the subtitle translations for many Korean films, including Parasite and Decision to Leave. A native of Massachusetts, he has been living in Seoul since 1997. The title of his talk is going to be Questions of Translation of Period Cinema. So, Darcy.
Recording in progress.
Hello?
Yes.
Hello?
We can hear you, Darcy.
Oh, you can? Okay.
Yeah.
It's really nice to be here today. Shall I jump right in and start with the presentation?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Okay, so first of all, thank you for inviting me today. It's a pleasure to talk to you about subtitle translation and classic films. Thank you to Uncle Min for inviting me personally and GYOPO for organizing the event. I guess perhaps I'll begin by explaining a little bit about how I got started in translating Korean films and how I got involved in Korean cinema in general. I moved to Korea in 1997 and was initially working as an English teacher university. And, this was a time when Korean films were not very well known outside of Korea, and even inside Korea, when I would ask my students what they felt about Korean cinema, typically they discouraged me, saying that that Korean cinema was not very interesting, that I needn't bother really watching them. But I was very curious to watch Korean films, and partly as a way to learn the language. I began to see films, and I was quite surprised at the quality of the films that I was seeing. There were new films coming out that didn't seem to be discussed anywhere else around the world, but which were quite interesting. And actually, within just a year or two, I also noticed an increasing interest among my students in Korean cinema. So they started to tell me, well, most Korean films aren't very interesting, but you should see this new film because it's really good. In the process of seeing these films, but then going onto the internet and not being able to find any information in English, I eventually decided, just as a hobby really, to create a website about Korean films that would introduce Korean films in English. It started quite small, but then in the coming years, particularly as more and more important films began to come out, and people in other countries began to become more interested in Korean cinema. And I started to get emails from people who had found my website. The website grew bigger and bigger. And after several years, I received an email from London asking me if I was interested in working as a journalist for the trade magazine, Screen International. And so at that point, I began working as a journalist, covering the Korean film industry. I quit teaching at that point for a while, and it was a really interesting experience because I got to meet a lot of people within the film industry, including the people who were in charge of marketing and selling Korean films internationally. And it gave me a lot of insight into how Korean films actually reach viewers in other parts of the world. I was a little bit naive at first about just the ability of films to travel simply on the basis of their quality. I thought if a film was good enough, that it would be discovered by people around the world. And I realized when kind of learning more about the industry that it's a process that takes a great deal of work behind the scenes and requires a lot of talent behind the scenes to effectively bring films from Korea or from other places to other countries. But the sales companies who I were getting to know at that point were the ones who were most involved in the translation process. And, compared to Japan, which had been selling its films internationally for decades, there was not a lot of experience in marketing Korean films internationally. And really there was no system in place for subtitle translation. There was a sense that many of these companies that had just been launched, or in some cases they were like the international division of larger companies like CJ or Showbox. The people working at these companies were establishing an effective system for subtitle translation. And because I knew them personally, sometimes they would ask me to either proofread or to revise a subtitle translation that they had received, but which they were not happy with. And so that's how I began kind of work with subtitles. And I found it really interesting, both as a viewer and as a fan of Korean cinema. I certainly appreciated the importance of subtitle translation and allowing international viewers to appreciate a film. And being very interested in languages as well. And I had studied languages in various forms as a student. found the process itself quite fascinating too. At that time, in the early 2000s, my Korean was not up to the level where I could fully translate a film on my own, but I began co-translating with a friend of mine who was a filmmaker himself, but who spoke English very well. And so we would sit down together in front of the TV, and I would type on my laptop, and we would kind of discuss things line by line, and we would translate films like that. And basically, I continued translating sort of part-time for many years. And it was 8 or 9 years ago when I felt that my Korean had reached a point where I could produce a first draft on my own. And at that point I began to specialize a bit more in translating, and to focus a bit more on that in comparison to my other work. When Parasite was released, obviously everything about the film was media section within Korea. Journalists were covering many different angles. Translation was one aspect of it that they began to talk about. Partly because it was continuing a sort of a public conversation that was started with the award, International Man Booker Prize given to the vegetarian, and the various discussions that resulted regarding translation. But yeah, since Parasite I've become very involved in translating, and so these days I'm teaching subtitle translation. Last year I started a translation company together with several of the translators who I was teaching in the previous year. And as time goes by, I'm doing more and more. In regard to classic films, most of the work that I do is with contemporary films, but I have been involved in doing some translations of classic films, particularly in relation to a film festival that I work with, the Housemaid Far East Film Festival, which is based in a city in Italy, not far from Venice. And for 25 years, they've been introducing films from East Asia, Southeast Asia to European audiences. And they have a great interest in retrospectives as well as contemporary films. So I've been working as a kind of program consultant for them, put together a few retrospectives, some small, some somewhat larger. And in the course of that, we've had to oversee translations for those films, to screen them at the festival. In some cases I've done the translation myself, or I've worked with other people. But those experiences have shown me that there is somewhat of a difference in the way that a translator might approach a classic film as opposed to a contemporary film. So let me share with you my PowerPoint file. I'll begin. Actually, I would like to begin by giving some general thoughts about subtitle translation before I turn specifically about films. Yeah, let me offer a few thoughts. Subtitle translation, it's a very specific sort of translation. And there are constraints involved in subtitle translation that don't exist, for example, translations of novels. The central one is the limitation of space, and that subtitles will appear on the screen quite briefly, and the audience won't have time to read it if the translation is too long. So when translating, there's a lot of compromise that's involved. Typically, when I look at a line of dialogue, I'll have some ideal translation in my mind, but it's quite rare that can simply put that ideal translation onto the screen because it's usually too long. And so any way it's possible to make a subtitle short, usually I just have to squeeze it in as much as possible. But there are other kinds of constraints as well. And that relates partly to the second point, in that the relationship between the original text and the translated text is quite unique in terms of subtitle translation. If we compare this again to the translation of a novel, novel translation essentially replaces the original text from the reader's perspective. When you're reading a novel translation, although it's possible to look at the original and to compare them, that's not typically how most people would consume a novel. So the translation replaces the original text. Subtitles exist alongside the original text. Even if the audience doesn't speak Korean, they will see the actors' faces, they will hear the characters speaking Korean. A lot of communication obviously is non-verbal, or even just the tone of an actor's voice can express a lot of the emotion. So the audience is receiving a lot of information and emotion from the screen and from the actors' performances. And the subtitles exist alongside that. And so ideally they should complement and enhance the full experience of the film. But it definitely doesn't replace the text completely. There's also the time element in that the text is not simply presented to the audience on a page where they can read it according to their own time. When they want to read it, but instead the translator is specifically choosing when the text will appear on the screen. How the words and images will combine on the screen, like what words will be on the screen as the audience is seeing a certain image. And there are implications for this in terms of like how you have a word order when you're translating a sentence, because the word order in Korean is very different from English. And yet you can get into problems if you translate without thinking about what's going to be on the screen in any given moment. And then the third thing I'll mention is that an actor's performance often determines how the audience reads the translation and interprets it. The audience is looking at the performance and hearing the performance and experiencing this performance. They are reading the text. So the subtitles will be read in a certain context. And it's very different from simply reading words on a page. A couple other things. Practical level subtitle translations are produced within a certain system. And that influences the final translation in various ways. I think when people talk about the need to kind of improve the quality of subtitles in the film industry, for example, there's a lot of focus on finding talented translators, which obviously is important. But I think it's just as important to create a good system in which the translator will work. Over the years, I think that this has improved in the Korean film industry. I don't work as much in TV or OTT or Netflix. I don't work with those sort of companies as much, but within the film industry, there's a system in place whereby a translation is thoroughly checked, and there's a lot of back and forth, and often the director is directly involved with revising and approving a final translation. So help to improve the quality of translations. And the last one, for various reasons, the subtitle translations come bound somewhat more closely to the original text than a literary translation usually would be. And there are a couple of different reasons for this, and it sort of depends on the film and the situation, but because the actor is performing on the screen, ideally you want the subtitles to match the performance. If you move too far away from the original translation, you can be creative with translation in that way. In a novel, I think you can kind of step further away from the original and be more creative to express things in unexpected or indirect ways. Whereas when you do this in translation, it's sometimes possible, but it creates certain problems in terms of the way that the subtitles are presented alongside the film. And then there's also the issue of, again, the system in which you produce the translation. As a translator, I generally don't have final say on a particular line. I may be speaking with the director, but often it's in discussions with the sales companies as well. They may prefer that I not do a particular kind of translation. Yeah, they have certain specific preferences. I think that in particular, sales companies want a translation to be as comfortable as possible. So, theorists of translation who argue that there are benefits to making the audience uncomfortable at some times, and to remind the audience that they're in a translation. A certain level of confusion may be a good thing in a translation. Those ideas receive a bit of pushback, I think, from the people who hire me as a translator. And so there's a certain degree of compromise in that respect. Okay, so I'd like to give a couple examples just of the way that translation works. I have some very short clips from contemporary films that will illustrate what I'm talking about. But first, let me show you a clip from a film called Mothers by director Lee Jong-man. This is a film that was released 4 or 5 years ago. The main character who we see on the screen, played by Irhe Sohn, is a woman whose husband has just passed away, and she's still in mourning. And the Korean title is 당신의 부탁, which is like your request. And it refers to different things within the film, but in this particular scene she receives a very difficult request. The family members of her late husband are asking her if she would be willing to take in a son of her husband from a previous marriage. And the boy's mother is no longer around, and he's been living with his grandmother, who recently passed away. So he has nowhere to live, and she doesn't feel like she's in a situation where she can take the boy in. But this is the moment in which she is given this request.
그래서 어쨌거나 그 애는 엄마가 키우는 게 맞지 않나 이렇게 얘기가 좀 나온 상황이에요. 그리고 또 아닌 말로 또 종욱이가 뭐 고아는 아니잖아요.
So I want to go back for a second to look at, this is this first sentence is divided up within 3 different subtitles. So the words are appearing on the screen, kind of in fragments. And it's in the second subtitle right here, highlighted in yellow, where she becomes aware of exactly what he's going to ask her. And I think that she has anticipated this to a certain extent. It doesn't come as a huge surprise. But this moment, when the second subtitle is on the screen, is when she understands exactly what he wants of her, and when she responds. And her response is quite subtle. This is a very subtle film in general, and we see her eyes somewhat widen. Otherwise, she doesn't make she doesn't have a strong reaction. But let me play that clip one more time.
그래서 어쨌거나 그 애는 엄마가 키우는 게 맞지 않나.
And so this is your reaction shot, essentially. I mean, one of the things that audiences look for as they're watching a film is how characters react to certain situations. And reaction shots are really important, I think, for how you tell a story. The thing with this, the translation written as it is, the translation is done in a word order that's most natural in English. So anyway, what we're thinking is maybe it's best if you raise him. Maybe it's best if you raise him where the request is made. However, it's in the second subtitle that she's reacting and that we're seeing her reaction. And so actually this is an example where I think there's a mismatch between what's happening on the screen and then what the audience is reading. And because the audience is reading this request right here, at this moment we're seeing the man's face. It's only when we turn to the last shot.
Darcy, sorry, I have to interrupt you. We have just a few more minutes, so just letting you know about 4 minutes.
Okay, so I'll wrap up quickly. Yeah, and so this, basically the reaction shot changes. And so for the audience who's reading the subtitles, the reaction shot is in the fourth subtitle, as opposed to the second subtitle where it should be. And so I'll play a second version where the subtitle matches what's happening on the screen.
그래서 어쨌거나 그 애는 엄마가 키우는 게 맞지 않나 이렇게 얘기가 좀 나온 상황이에요. 그리고 또 아닌 말로 또 종욱이가 뭐 고아는 아니잖아요.
Okay, so briefly, another big issue is how you handle cultural references in translation. What do you do when there's some aspect of the film that's unfamiliar to the audience? One option is to change it to something more familiar, but then there are issues with that as well. And so these are examples, sort of contemporary examples, but a line like, would you lend me 50,000 won? You could translate this as, would you lend me $50? And quite a simple thing, but there's something that is sort of uncomfortable about erasing an aspect of local culture and then replacing it with something that's more widely recognized internationally. On the other hand, you have to ask the question, like, is it fair to expect viewers to have a detailed knowledge of Korean culture in order to understand a text? And there's this tension between the two. Ultimately, I think it comes to a case-by-case situation. These examples are examples where it is important for the audience to understand. Like, if it says your boyfriend looks like Ibyahan, this could be a compliment, it could be an insult if Ibyahan is an ugly politician. So the approach to this, there are questions that I ask myself, like, is it important for the viewer to know the precise meaning of the reference? Will the meaning be clear in context? Sometimes just by simply watching the scene, or is there space to include some kind of explanation? So if you say your boyfriend is as good looking as Ibyahan, then this would make it clear in what context the line is. And so my general approach is that I prefer to keep kind of the Korean elements, even if they're unfamiliar to the audience, as long as it's not too confusing. But it is a real case-by-case question. And I also am speaking with the director and the sales company, so they particular metrics we found. So there's several ways in which kind of translating films from the Golden Age are different from working on contemporary films. If we look first at, who are the people who are commissioning these subtitles, primarily it's the Korean Film Archive with their YouTube channel. The films that appear in the YouTube channel, those subtitles are commissioned by the Film Archive directly. They also put out DVD and Blu-ray releases, amazing releases, and they put a lot of work into subtitling both the feature film and also the kind of the special experience. And then the Film Archive does do theatrical screenings in Seoul. These are typically done without subtitles. However, they work together with film festivals. And so international film festivals, when they screen films, they may arrange for special screenings and retrospectives. And these screenings require subtitles. It may be that subtitles already exist because the film is on their YouTube channel. But in cases where the subtitles don't exist, often it is the film festival that, commissions the subtitle, commissions the translation, and then maybe they'll donate it to the film archive afterwards. And then there are sometimes commercial releases in theaters, in OTT services. There may be Blu-ray or DVD labels like Criterion, but would release older films and would choose subtitles themselves. But in general, I think the system is different. Broadly, I can say there's less oversight when working on these older films, because typically they're done for a film festival, and there's not as strong a commercial element to it. So you don't have a sales company pushing you to make the film as kind of, easily understood as possible. And so you can be a little bit more, creative or provocative in this kind of a system. Translating cultural and historical references, similar to what I just said, is a particular challenge for translators of classic films. Because, the more that viewers understand the cultural and historical and social context in which the films are taking place, the better they'll be able to understand them. And I think, you have a very limited scope as a subtitle translator, but to a certain extent, you can provide a little bit of extra context or help to the audience in understanding some of what's going on. In the same way as that line which I mentioned, let's say, there's a line, your boyfriend looks like some heavy than you get him. And again, just the word like, as good looking as Shin would help to give audiences some context. A major one is tone, because these films are set in the past, and because the characters are speaking in a way that is different from contemporary films. On a basic level, it makes sense to avoid words that sound very contemporary. But there's a question of how dated you want the dialogue to feel. Different translators would handle this in different ways. Do you want to be really using some language that feels quite dated? Or do you want to do that in a more subtle way? There's the other issue that, when you watch screenings of classic Korean films with an audience, there's a big difference between watching them with a Korean audience or watching them outside of Korea with an audience where most of the audience doesn't speak Korean. There's a lot of laughter in the screenings in Korea, and it's warm-hearted laughter, I think. They're not necessarily laughing at the characters, but because of the very different style of speech, there are a lot of unexpected expressions and just the style of speech strikes viewers in a very particular way. And this is another kind of dilemma, I think, for the translator. If you have kind of a mixed audience, and the non-Korean speakers will be sitting and hearing the Koreans around them lacking certain lines of dialogue. If they can't sense any of the humor in the translation, then they may feel like they're missing out something in the film. Again, it's a question that I don't think there's one right answer to this, but should the translator try to replicate, to a certain extent, those humorous moments for non-Korean viewers? And finally, there's the fact that classic Korean films tend to be post-dubbed. I often think about subtitle translation as not translating a text, but instead translating a performance. Because the audience is looking at an actor and hearing them speak and watching them react to things around them. That does have a big effect on how you translate a certain line. And it just adds a bit of a wrinkle because in many films from the 1960s, they were shot on the set, but then all of the sound was done later. Particularly for very busy actors like Housemaid, who shot over 600 films in his career. He didn't have time to go to the sound studio to record his own voice. And so there was one particular voice actor who did all of his dubbing. But when I say that I'm translating a performance, I'm actually translating the visual image of one particular person and then the voice of another person. And sometimes there isn't, you can feel a bit of a gap between the emotional register of the voice and the performer on the screen. So that is one last thing that runs through my mind when I'm working on these films. Korean film companies, when they're working on contemporary films, they invest a considerable amount of time and effort. There's a general recognition of them important films. Inevitably, because, just for economic reasons, when Korean classic films translated, it's often being done for one, like a single screening at a film festival, or perhaps a DVD release that is not expected to make a lot of money. So that there's less resources that go into translations of classic films. But I think that good translations matter even more for classic films than they do for contemporary films, given the kind of distance involved. So I hope that this is a topic that certainly would benefit from more kind of discussion in the future. I'm trying to talk a bit to the Korean Film Archive as well to share ideas about how to best handle this going forward. Thank you very much.
Hello? Oh, here we go. Okay, thank you so much. This is such a really interesting and vibrant panel. And we are really sort of over time, so probably I think the best thing is to we're going to offer 10 minutes for Q&A. So I think we're just going to kind of go straight into that. And just to kind of briefly sort of summarize, we went through really different sort of themes for this panel, right? We worked through war films, also female directors, as well as translation. So how do we kind of bring those all together, right? I'm thinking about the post-war era is such an interesting period in time that I think continues to make an impact on filmmaking and also the broader sort of Korean history as well, right? Let's just go ahead and see if folks have questions. And if you do have questions, if you can come up to the microphone over there, that is available for you to ask questions. So, anyone? Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I have a question for Darcy. This is Scott Different. Good to see you. Really enjoyed your talk, and I know you've spoken at length elsewhere about some of the challenges and difficulties of providing subtitles as translation. I'm just wondering if you've been asked to work in a slightly different capacity, providing subtitles for accessibility purposes. So have you been asked to subtitle works for deaf and hard of hearing audiences? And if so, if that involves a different set of skills and requirements and thoughts. And just thinking back to some of your comments about translating for South Korean Golden Age or classic films from the 50s and 60s, obviously there will be idiomatic expressions and very specific turns of phrase that are outmoded. And I'm just curious how much or how little research is involved in terms of figuring out what people were actually saying back then, if it's a very unusual kind of colloquial or idiomatic expression that would not be familiar to contemporary audiences.
Okay, to answer the first part of your question, I haven't been involved in translations for, for deaf viewers or for, there are film festivals in Korea that have focused on expanding accessibility on films to broader audiences. And there's a lot of work being done there to kind of create specific versions of films with audio description or with descriptive subtitles. But those are all done within the Korean language. And so actually, because I'm based in Korea, actually I'm less involved in those sorts of efforts. Mostly I've just been working with Korean film companies to create kind of the initial translation for festival screenings and commercial releases. When I mentioned specific expressions from the past, but there is really an interesting linguistic gap between the 60s and the present day. And it really kind of hit me when I was working on, a couple of years ago, I was organizing kind of a special focus on films from the 60s and 70s for the Housemaid Film Festival. I was working on the film Promise of the Flesh by Kim Hyun. And Kim Hyun is a director who his dialogue is quite distinctive anyway. Park Chan-wook has talked about how he was much inspired by Kim Hyun, and that he's taken a somewhat similar approach to writing the dialogue in his films, in that they don't sound completely natural, like there's something artificial about the way that the characters speak, but it's incredibly expressive at the same time. Certainly, it was so much different than anything I'd done before, and a lot of it was really hard for me to understand. And so I did have to kind of sit down and ask for some help in interpreting a lot of the expressions, whereas, with contemporary films, I usually don't have to. I think to do a translation of a classic film properly would require a lot of research, and having background information would help a lot. Really briefly, I'll just mention one last thing. For example, in the film A Day Off by McHugh, they're a couple who they only have time to meet on Sundays. They're they're quite struggling financially, and they don't have the money to go into a cafe and to sit and drink a coffee and to talk to each other. I don't know if this is something that the director was kind of referencing in an indirect way, or if this was connected at all, but right around the time that the film was coming out, the Park Chung-hee administration was trying to suppress coffee imports because he wanted to limit the amount of hard currency that was leaving the country, and coffee was one thing that you can't produce in Korea. So apparently the price of coffee was really high in the mid to late 60s. And again, I don't know enough about the background of the film, and I'm not a historian about the period, but this adds kind of an interesting context in which to view these scenes where they're outside the cafe and they can't afford to go in. And so instead they walk around on this really cold day. Knowledge like that, I mean, sometimes if you can add little, even just the word like expensive coffee or something like that, there may be a way to tell the viewer that, coffee in these days was really expensive compared to other times in Korea. All that kind of research would potentially help, but it depends on just how much time you have.
Okay, great. Anyone else from the audience like to ask? Come on up.
Hello? I just wanted to say thank you so much for your research on a female judge. I really was inspired by the director's reflection to a male audience and what the message was of that movie to a male audience, including also how that has transcended the decades and echoed into our time. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
I'm sorry about. Okay. Thank you for the question, and I'm sorry about holding a cough drop in my mouth because I had a very serious cold like last month, and I'm fully recovered except for this continuing cough. So your question is about the responses from male audiences, is that correct? I was just wondering too.
Yes, about the film, yes.
One of the things about doing some research about audience responses of this classical era Korean film is that there is no very clear data to actually have this idea. So anything that's recorded as, something that we can kind of assume as a response, like this film reviews and these kind of very short blurbs from the newspapers. These are basically kind of course they are mostly male, but those writers are mostly male. But at the same time, these are mostly written from a certain perspective, socioeconomic position, right? So who can write, who has this power on the paper, and who has this authority. So we cannot really kind of clearly, transparently accept that as a general male viewer's point. So that's something we have to be cautious about. So I can't really say about that. But from that, still, with that limit, we can understand how the film was still received very well in the era. Like they have probably kind of agreed upon this kind of general message about the movie. And then when you actually watch the movie is not necessarily very much, feminist, quote unquote feminist, in a way that it truly kind of returns to this original kind of structure, one that may be challenged by another something similar argument that Christina Klein has made her research about Han Hyung-mo, but still in this very conservative ending might be another challenge, and then it might be a kind of comfort for those male writers. Thank you for the question.
This is also a question for Dr. Sohn, although again, thank you to the entire panel, all the speakers today. I think we heard from some of the other speakers how they became interested in the line, eat money, but I don't actually know quite how you got to be interested in this female director, and I wondered if you're being a professor at Smith College, if your student body or the ethos there informs your research.
Oh, thank you for that question. Frankly speaking, there is no, my current research project is about the colonial film history. So basically it's about how to see a film history when there is not many film materials, but also there are, more cases of failure than success. And how to tell this story without making them too embellished, but at the same time not too dark or dismal. So that's one of my kind of research questions that I have right now. And this is basically my perspective about film history, which is, I'm more interested in kind of more marginalized cases. So I've been doing this research for over the last decade, but I'm currently looking at some other kind of possibility of my continuing research. And last summer, I watched this film, 2022 film, Homage, and that really got me to think about this 1960 movie again, which I saw way back years ago. So I was just thinking about those movies over the summer and in the fall, and then Yong-sun just contacted me. So that's what initiated this research. So basically this research began with this event. So I really appreciate this opportunity because otherwise I would just have this as an idea and not really have an opportunity to develop into any kind of writing. So thank you so much.
If I may squeeze in a really quick question to Darcy. As a subtitle, as a professional, how do you know when your work is done? Is there a visceral sense, I've got it, this is the very best, given all those constraints you outlined? And then of course, when you see the system maybe reworking that, but you personally, when do you feel like this is it? Is it even kind of that haptic response that we heard about yesterday?
It is, I think it's always possible to improve. At some point, you just have to let go. It's not that much different, I think, from writing an essay, in that you write a first draft, and then you can improve it with a second draft and a third draft, and you could just continue working on it forever. But basically, when usually it's around the third draft that I have to let go of the film. There may be times when for certain directors, they'll want to sit down together and watch the film and kind of go over it, even line by line. And in those cases, it's kind of very clear when we reach the end because, we reach the end of that process together. In other cases where I'm working on my own, there are always time constraints, and so, sometimes I have to let go of the film before I necessarily really want to, but I never send a draft without putting in at least, I do one draft, I do one very thorough revision, and I think the second revision is really the most important one, because I go through the film again and I listen to everything, and I change so much in that revision stage. After that point, it's mostly about details, and if I've had enough time to do that second revision properly, then the timing should be the timing should be good. And yeah, it's all about finding details that can be improved. But yeah, for the most part, most of the work is done after that second revision.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, I have one question. Oh, wait. Oh, yes, please.
Scott, this is a question for you. I'm curious about that generic promiscuity, which is such a distinctive feature of Korean film and causes some American viewers to have a hard time with it. Do you have a theory as to why that is? Why is this such a distinctive element of Korean cinema? Where does that come from?
I don't necessarily have a theory. It's just, and I don't want to be prescriptive or programmatic and say they're all like this or even a majority are like this. But I do see some parallels between what I'm calling generic promiscuity in the 1960s and the sort of tonal destabilization that I've experienced in more contemporary films. And so I'm thinking about GYOPO, or The Host, a film that came out a few years ago, and that's a film that does similar things, right? At one moment you're bereaving the apparent loss of family members, and you're seeing family members wailing and crying, and it becomes so excessive that it starts to bleed over into laughter. And it just keeps shifting like that, so you're never on stable ground. And I'm sure there are more well-versed people here in this room who could probably answer this question better, but it's just something that, again, I don't want to be programmatic, but for me it distinguishes Korean cinema, and maybe sets it apart from some other national cinemas around the world where that's true. I do know that in the 60s, out of economic necessity, Imani had to be well practiced in all the genres because they were expected to meet certain quotas. They had to make a certain number of films each year. And if they didn't, those companies, those 15 companies that existed, their licenses would be revoked. They could no longer make films. And so they were expected to make a certain number of films every year, and that meant necessarily that they had to be well practiced in comedy, musicals, and gangster films. And it also meant that they had to sometimes surreptitiously borrow plot lines from other national cinemas like Japan. I think Stephen Chung mentioned that. It's not quite plagiarism necessarily, but it's, again, out of necessity. You're running out of time. You need to have a scenario in front of you. And there's one already ready-made for you in Japan. So, yeah, I think that's another factor. The economic and industrial situation in which Imani faced or found himself necessitated being gifted in that sense.
All right, well, I'll ask one question and then we can end. So my question is, I think that the presentations for two of you, I felt like I could kind of connect them to thinking about kinship and family structure, especially since, the Korean War was such a huge impact on Korea, and we see that sort of fracture in so many ways in the representation of family, and also just thinking about these questions around gender roles, which of course we could see, even from the colonial era, but as Irhe was talking about in the film that in The Female Judge, right? So I was wondering if maybe each of you can kind of speak a little bit about kinship in the films that you talked about. Yeah.
I would say that even in films that aren't explicitly about the Korean War, that are set obviously after the Korean War, and here I'm thinking of Stray Bullet or Aimless Bullet, which is about a lot of things. It's about a man who's suffering a toothache. It's about a geriatric woman who seems to be having mental problems. It's about a young woman who, out of economic necessity, prostitutes herself for American GIs. It's about a lot of different things. It's a very bleak picture of a social reality that the Park Chung-hee regime did not look favorably upon. And I think
a lot of the cases of censorship or quasi-censorship that occurred in the 60s, again, if not explicitly about the Korean War, they were about sort of the devastating effects of the war on the populace and the kind of fracturing of families that occurred. We see a lot of plot lines, like A Day Off, for instance, which is about this, it's a very desolate kind of setting, destitute man, penniless pretty much, as is the woman. And I think, unless I'm just mixing this up with another film, she's thinking about having an abortion. And so one of the many reasons why the film was prevented from theatrical release. I think that that overall negativity really infuses 60s cinema, so much so that the mandate of national uplift, that was the Park Chung-hee regime's real goal for cinema, was to uplift the populace and have them get on board with his industrialization and modernization plans. That starts to fall by the wayside in the presence of these narratives where nothing seems to work out for the protagonists and the families fall apart. Again, this is more, I'm not going into depth here, I'm just kind of giving a very superficial view of the cinema, but I think it distinguishes itself from other national cinemas at that time.
So what is really interesting about the family structure in A Female Judge is that this family that is restored in the end of the movie was actually already dysfunctional before Jin-suk was coming in, right? So the children were spoiled so much already, and her wife has this big secret that she had a son from her first marriage that nobody has known. So in the end, we can say that this family is restored by Jin-suk, who was considered an intruder, or who was considered a boss of everybody, that wins this kind of only rational man who is Mr. Chang, the father's heart. So, that's quite an interesting dynamic, I think. Very different dynamic that we can think when it comes to the very common conflict in Korean drama, like daughter-in-law, mother-in-law conflict. It's quite very different. All the conflict is resolved by this daughter-in-law who defends her mother-in-law, and then she eventually kind of restores the family. So I can't really say much about more on a social or discursive level because I'm really at the early stage of kind of doing this research. But at the same time, there's a very interesting parallel when it comes to think about how the first woman director, Park Nam-mok's movie, 1954 movie, was entitled A Widow. So it was also about a war widow. And then the first movie of the second woman director put this widow issue at the center of the course case. This director's second movie was a single mom. So there certainly is a kind of this resonance about the sensibility among this woman's experience after the war. And so given that she was quite in a circle of very commercial filmmaking, and her debut as a director was partly a calculated move by the industry in a way that they can use that as an advertisement toward women audiences in a way. So maybe that, maybe we can speculate upon some of the possible relationship between the audience and the movie in terms of this imagination. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Okay, thank you so much. I think we can offer a round of applause to our... Thank you so much for attending and sticking it out.